Welcome to another video on stories of our history. Imagine a world of mist-shrouded islands, of jagged cliffs rising from a cold and restless sea, of green valleys tucked between barren, windswept hills. This is the northern edge of Britain, the archipelagos of Orkney, Shetland, and the Hebrides, a realm that in the late 8th century after the birth of Christ was home to a complex mosaic of peoples, the Picts, whose enigmatic symbol stones still dot the landscape, their meaning lost to time, the Gaels of Dalriada, the Irish-speaking kingdom that straddled the sea between Antrim and Argyll, and the monks of the Celtic Church, who had built their isolated monasteries on wave-battered skerries. Like Iona, carrying the flame of Latin learning in the cold northern twilight. For these peoples, the sea was not a barrier but a highway, a network of watery paths that connected the islands to each other and to the wider world. The Picts, who were the descendants of the Iron Age tribes that the Romans had failed to conquer, had built their brachs, those massive, circular stone towers, as a defense against the maritime raiders of their own age. The Gaels, who had crossed from Ireland in the 5th century, had established a warrior aristocracy, a society of petty kings, cattle raids, and epic poetry, a world that would later be immortalized in the sagas and the annals. The monks, followers of the tradition of Saint Columba, who had founded Iona in 563, had created a network of learning and devotion that was one of the lights of the Dark Ages. This was the world that the Vikings came to shatter, and ultimately, to transform. The first recorded Viking raid on Scottish soil occurred in 794, a year after the infamous sack of Lindisfarne, the monastery on the coast of Northumbria that had sent a shockwave of terror through the Christian kingdoms of the West. The target, according to the Annals of Ulster, the great chronicle of the Irish monks, was the devastation of all the islands of Britain by the Gentiles. The Gentiles, the pagans, were the Norsemen, the men from the fjords of Norway, who had taken to the sea in their revolutionary new vessels, the longships, and who had discovered a world of undefended wealth, ripe for the taking. The early raids, which struck Iona, Skye, and the other islands of the Hebrides, were swift, brutal, and devastating. The monks, who were the primary chroniclers of the age, recorded the events with a mixture of horror and a sense of apocalyptic dread, seeing the Norsemen as the fulfillment of the biblical prophecies, a scourge sent by God to punish the sins of a fallen people. But the raids on Scotland were different from the hit-and-run attacks on the wealthy monasteries of Ireland and England. The Vikings who came to the Northern Isles were looking for more than portable loot. They were looking for land, for bases, for a new home in the cold, familiar waters of the North Atlantic. The geography of the Northern Isles, Orkney, Shetland, and the Hebrides, was perfectly suited to the needs of the Viking sea kings. These archipelagos, which stretched like a broken chain from the coast of Norway to the shores of Ireland, were the ideal stepping stones for the longships, providing sheltered harbors, fresh water, and strategic vantage points from which to control the maritime trade routes. The Shetland Islands, which lie about 170 kilometers northeast of the Scottish mainland, were the first landfall for the Norse ships crossing the North Sea from the fjords of western Norway, a voyage of about 300 kilometers that could be accomplished in a few days with a favorable wind. The Orkney Islands, which lie just south of Shetland, were the gateway to the Irish Sea and the rich pickings of the Hebrides, the Isle of Man, and the east coast of Ireland. The Hebrides themselves, a maze of islands and sea locks that stretch from the Bud of Lewis in the north to the Mull of Kintyre in the south, were a perfect base for the raiders, a labyrinth of waterways that the Norsemen, with their shallow draft ships, could navigate with ease, but that the larger vessels of their enemies could not penetrate. The Scottish coastline, with its deep sea locks and its sheltered bays, offered countless hiding places for the Viking fleets, a geography that the Norsemen would exploit to the full. The specific evidence for the early Viking presence in the Northern Isles is a combination of the archaeological record, the linguistic evidence, and the later Norse sagas, particularly the Orkneyinga saga, the Saga of the Earls of Orkney, which was written in Iceland in the late 12th or early 13th century, but which preserves the oral traditions of the Norse settlement. The saga, which is a blend of the historical fact and the literary embellishment, tells the story of the conquest of the islands by the Norwegian king Harald Fairhair in the late 9th century, a conquest that was the culmination of a process of the gradual infiltration and the violent takeover that had begun decades earlier. According to the saga, Harald, who was the first king to unify Norway, sailed west to suppress the Viking raiders who were using the islands as a base for their attacks on his own kingdom, and he granted the earldom of Orkney to his ally, Ragnvald Eysteinn, the Earl of Moor, as a reward for his loyalty. The saga, which is a crucial source for the early history of the Norse and Scotland, is a window into the world of the Sea Kings, a world of the feuds, the alliances, the battles, and the dynastic marriages that shaped the political landscape of the Northern Isles. The archaeological evidence for the Norse settlement of the Northern Isles is extensive and compelling, a record of the material culture that the Vikings brought with them and that they adapted to the new environment. The excavations at Jarlshof, on the southern tip of Shetland, have revealed a remarkable sequence of the settlements that spans over 4,000 years, from the Neolithic to the medieval period, including a substantial Norse settlement that dates from the 9th to the 13th centuries. The Norse longhouses, which were built of the stone and the turf, with the central hearths and the sleeping benches along the walls, are the classic example of the Viking domestic architecture, a design that was well adapted to the harsh climate of the North Atlantic. The artifacts that have been recovered from the Norse sites in Orkney and Shetland, including the jewelry, the weapons, the tools, and the everyday household items, are a vivid record of the lives of the settlers, a people who were the farmers, the fishermen, the craftsmen, and the warriors, a people who were building a new life in a new land. The runic inscriptions that have been found on the stones and the artifacts across the Northern Isles, including the famous Maesho runes in Orkney, which were carved by the Norse visitors to the ancient chamber tomb in the 12th century, are a direct link to the language and the culture of the Viking settlers, a voice from the past that speaks of the everyday concerns of the people. The genetic legacy of the Norse settlement in the Northern Isles is a powerful and an enduring testimony to the scale and the completeness of the Viking colonization. The modern populations of Orkney and Shetland, according to the genetic studies that have been conducted by the researchers at the University of Edinburgh and the other institutions, carry a significant proportion of the Norse DNA, a genetic signature that is distinct from the rest of the Scottish population and that is most similar to the modern populations of the Western Norway. The Y chromosome markers, which are passed down from the father to the son, indicate that a large proportion of the male settlers were of the Norse origin, a pattern that is consistent with the historical accounts of the Viking colonization, which describe the replacement, or the subjugation of the native Pictish elites by the Norse warriors. The mitochondrial DNA, which is passed down from the mother to the children, tells a more complex story, a story that includes the significant contributions of the native women, a reflection of the intermarriage and the cultural fusion that occurred in the generations after the initial conquest. The genetic legacy of the Vikings is written in the blood of the modern islanders, a permanent record of the Norse migration that is the foundation of the history of the Northern Isles. The world that the Vikings entered when they first sailed into the waters of the Northern Isles was a world that was already ancient, a landscape that had been shaped by the millennia of the human habitation and that was rich with the monuments of the previous cultures. The Picts, who were the dominant people of the northern and the eastern Scotland during the early medieval period, were the descendants of the Iron Age tribes that the Romans had called the Caledonii, the people of the woods, a confederation of the warrior societies that had successfully resisted the Roman conquest and that had maintained their independence behind the walls of Hadrian and Antonine. The Picts, whose name comes from the Latin picti, the painted ones, a reference to their custom of the tattooing or the body painting, were a mysterious and a fascinating people, who left behind a remarkable artistic legacy in the form of the carved symbol stones that dot the Scottish landscape, the enigmatic designs of the animals, the objects, and the abstract shapes that have never been fully deciphered. The Pictish language, which was a form of the Brittonic Celtic, related to the Welsh and the Breton, has largely vanished, surviving only in a few place names and in the inscriptions on the stones. The Pictish society, as far as it can be reconstructed from the archaeological and the historical evidence, was a complex, hierarchical, and a warrior-dominated culture, with a powerful kingship, a sophisticated legal system, and a vibrant artistic tradition. The Gaels of Dal Riata, who were the other major group in the region, were the Irish-speaking people who had crossed the North Channel from the Antrim in the 5th and the 6th centuries, establishing a kingdom that spanned the sea between the Ireland and the Scotland. The capital of Dal Riata was at Dunad, a formidable hill fort in the Kilmartin Glen in Argyll, a place that was the centre of the royal power and the ceremony, where the kings were inaugurated by the placing of the foot in a carved stone footprint, a ritual that was the symbol of their authority over the land. The Gaels, who were the bearers of the Irish culture, the language, the laws, and the Christianity, were the dynamic and the expansive force in the region, and their influence was felt across the Hebrides and the western seaboard. The monastery of Iona, which was founded by St. Columba in 563, was the spiritual heart of the Gaelic world, a center of the learning and the art that produced the illuminated manuscripts, such as the Book of Kells, and that sent the missionaries across the northern Britain and beyond. The Gaels of Dal Riata, who were the warriors, the poets, and the monks, were the dominant culture of the western Scotland at the time of the Viking arrival. The political landscape of the northern Britain in the 8th century was a complex and a constantly shifting mosaic of the petty kingdoms, the tribal confederations, and the competing dynasties. The Picts, who were divided into a number of the kingdoms, the most powerful of which was the Fortriu, the region around the Moray Firth and the Strathen, were engaged in a constant struggle for the dominance, a struggle that was marked by the battles, the assassinations, and the dynastic marriages. The Gaels of Dal Riata, who were also divided into the competing kindreds, the Senon Gabrain and the Senelone, were the rivals and the occasional allies of the Picts, and the border between the two peoples was a zone of the conflict and the exchange. The Britons of Strathclyde, who were the descendants of the native Celtic peoples of the southern Scotland, were another player in the political game, a kingdom that was based on the great rock fortress of the Dumbarton, and that controlled the lands around the Clyde Valley. The Angles of Northumbria, who were the Germanic invaders who had conquered the southeast of the Scotland in the 7th century, were the southern threat, a powerful and an aggressive kingdom that was the dominant force in the northern England and that was pushing northward into the Pictish and the Gaelic territories. This was the world that the Vikings disrupted, a world of the ancient rivalries and the fragile alliances that was about to be shattered by the arrival of a new and a terrifying force. The monastic network of the Celtic Church, which was the primary source of the written records for the early Viking period, was a unique and a vital part of the Scottish landscape. The Celtic Church, which had developed independently of the Roman Church in the centuries after the withdrawal of the legions, was characterized by its emphasis on the monasticism, the asceticism, and the missionary activity. The monasteries, such as Iona, Applecross, and Deer, were the centers of the learning, the art, and the devotion, and they were the repositories of the precious objects, the gold and silver chalices, the jeweled reliquaries, the illuminated manuscripts, that were the irresistible lure for the Viking raiders. The monks, who were the chroniclers of the age, recorded the coming of the Norsemen with a sense of the horror and the despair, seeing the raids as the fulfillment of the biblical prophecies of the destruction and the judgment. The Annals of Ulster, the Annals of Lindisfarne, and the other Irish annals, which are the primary sources for the early Viking period in the Scotland, are a litany of the raids, the burnings, the killings, and the plunderings, a grim record of the impact of the Norsemen on the Christian communities of the islands and the coast. The specific geography of the Hebrides, which were the first and the most heavily affected of the Scottish islands by the Viking raids, was a crucial factor in the pattern of the Norse settlement. The Hebrides, a chain of over 200 islands that stretch from the Lewis and Harris in the north to the Islay and the Gia in the south, are a world of the contrasts, the rugged, mountainous interiors and the fertile, green coastal strips, the sheltered sea lochs and the exposed, windswept headlands. The islands, which had been inhabited since the Mesolithic period, were home to a Gaelic-speaking population that was organized into a number of the small kingdoms and the tribal groupings, a society that was based on the cattle raising, the fishing, and the small-scale agriculture. The Hebrides, which are separated from the mainland by the Minch and the Sea of the Hebrides, were a world apart, a maritime realm that was connected to the Ireland, the Isle of Man, and the western Scotland by the network of the sea routes. The Vikings, who were the masters of the sea, recognized the strategic value of the Hebrides immediately, and they set about the conquest and the colonization of the islands with a speed and a thoroughness that was remarkable even for the age of the Viking expansion. The Hebrides, which were to become the heartland of the Norse-Gaelic kingdom of the Isles, were the first and the most complete of the Viking conquests in Scotland. The Viking longships, which were the revolutionary technology that enabled the Norse expansion across the North Atlantic, were the product of the centuries of the evolution of the Scandinavian shipbuilding tradition, a tradition that was rooted in the needs of the coastal communities of the Norway, the Sweden, and the Denmark. The longship, which was known to the Norsemen as the langskip, was a masterpiece of the naval engineering, a vessel that was designed for the speed, the maneuverability, and the seaworthiness, a combination of the qualities that made it the most formidable warship of the early medieval period. The longship, which was built of the overlapping planks of the oak, the pine, or the ash, a technique known as the clinker or the lapstrake construction, was a light, flexible, and a strong vessel, capable of withstanding the punishing conditions of the North Atlantic and of navigating the shallow rivers and the estuaries that were the highways of the Viking expansion. The longship, which was propelled by a combination of the square sail and the oars, could reach the speeds of up to the 15 knots under the favorable conditions, a speed that was unmatched by any other vessel of the age. The specific design of the Viking longship, which was the key to the Norse success in the raids and the invasions, was a brilliant adaptation to the conditions of the northern seas. The hull, which was long, narrow, and shallow drafted, allowed the ship to ride over the waves rather than plowing through them, a characteristic that gave the longship its remarkable speed and its ability to navigate the coastal waters and the inland rivers that were the targets of the Viking attacks. The keel, which was a single, massive piece of the oak that ran the length of the hull, was the backbone of the ship, providing the strength and the stability. The mast, which was stepped in the center of the ship, supported a single, large square sail, which was made of the wool or the linen, and which was often dyed with the red and the white stripes, a distinctive and an intimidating sight for the coastal communities of Europe. The oars, which were used for the maneuvering in the calm or the confined waters, were arranged along the sides of the ship, with each oar pulled by a single crewman, a design that allowed the longship to move independently of the wind, a crucial advantage in the unpredictable conditions of the North Atlantic. The construction of a Viking longship was a complex and a highly skilled process that required the expertise of the master shipwrights, the men who had inherited the knowledge of the generations of the boat builders and who understood the properties of the wood, the sea, and the wind. The shipwrights, who worked in the open-air shipyards that were located on the sheltered fjords and the inlets of the Scandinavian coast, began the process by selecting the timber, the tall, straight oaks that were split with the wedges and the axes to produce the planks that were the basis of the clinker construction. The planks, which were hewn to a precise thickness and shape, were overlapped and fastened together with the iron rivets, a technique that produced a hull that was both flexible and watertight. The framing, which was added after the planking was complete, consisted of the ribs and the crossbeams that were shaped from the naturally curved branches of the oak and the pine, a method that gave the hull its strength and its resilience. The construction of a longship, which could take the months or even the years to complete, was a major investment of the time and the resources, a testament to the importance of the sea in the Scandinavian culture. The navigational techniques of the Vikings, which enabled them to cross the vast and the treacherous waters of the North Atlantic and to find their way to the remote islands of Scotland, were a sophisticated combination of the observation, the experience, and the traditional knowledge. The Vikings, who did not have the compass or the accurate maps, relied on the natural signs, the flight of the birds, the movement of the whales, the color and the temperature of the water, the smell of the land, to guide them across the open sea. The sunstone, a crystal of the calcite or the cordierite that was found in the Norway and the Iceland, may have been used to locate the position of the sun on the overcast days, a technique that was known to the medieval mariners and that has been demonstrated by the modern experiments. The bearing dial, a simple instrument that was used to measure the angle of the sun at the noon, allowed the navigators to determine their latitude, a crucial piece of the information for the long-distance voyages. The Vikings, who were the masters of the practical navigation, accumulated a vast body of the knowledge about the winds, the currents, and the landmarks of the North Atlantic, a knowledge that was passed down from the father to the son, and that was the key to their success as the explorers and the colonizers. The specific adaptations of the Viking longships to the conditions of the Scottish waters were a crucial factor in the Norse success in the region. The shallow draft of the longship, which was typically less than a meter, allowed the vessels to navigate the narrow sea locks, the shallow estuaries, and the tidal waters of the Hebrides and the Northern Isles, a capability that was essential for the surprise attacks and the rapid withdrawals that were the hallmark of the Viking raids. The maneuverability of the longship, which could be turned quickly and easily, was a decisive advantage in the confined waters of the Scottish coast, where the larger and the heavier vessels of the Picts and the Gaels were at a disadvantage. The speed of the longship, which could outrun any other vessel of the age, allowed the Vikings to strike without the warning and to escape before the local forces could be mobilized. The longship, which was the perfect weapon for the hit-and-run warfare, was the key to the Viking conquest of the Northern Isles. The specific ports and the harbors that the Vikings used in Scotland were the natural anchorages that had been the stopping places for the mariners since the prehistoric times, the sheltered bays and the deep sea locks that were the nodes of the maritime network of the North Atlantic. The Bay of Scyll in Orkney, where the famous settlement of the Skara Brae had been built by the Neolithic peoples over 4,000 years earlier, was a natural harbor that was used by the Vikings, a place that was later known as the Bursey, the center of the Norse power in the islands. The Loch na Ard on the Isle of Skye, a deep, sheltered inlet that was connected to the sea by a narrow channel, was a perfect hiding place for the Viking longships, a place where the raiders could lie in wait for their prey. The Jarlshof in Shetland, which we have already mentioned, was a natural harbor that had been used by the seafarers for the millennia, a place that was the site of the first Norse settlement in the islands. The Vikings, who were the masters of the sea, knew how to read the landscape and how to find the safe harbors, a skill that was the foundation of their power in Scotland. The first contact between the Vikings and the native peoples of Scotland, the Picts and the Gaels, was a violent and a traumatic event, a clash of the cultures that was marked by the bloodshed, the destruction, and the terror. The early raids, which were recorded by the Irish annals and the other chroniclers, were focused on the wealthy monasteries of the Hebrides and the western coast, the soft targets that were filled with the precious objects, and that were defended only by the unarmed monks. The monastery of Iona, which was the most sacred site in the Gaelic world, the burial place of the kings of Dal Riata and the Picts, was attacked repeatedly by the Vikings, in 795, 802, and 806, when the entire community of the 68 monks was slaughtered by the raiders. The survivors, who were led by the abbot Selleck, eventually abandoned the island in 825, moving the center of the Columban community to the safer location of the Kells in the Ireland, taking with them the precious relics and the manuscripts, including the Book of Kells, which may have been begun on Iona. The sacking of Iona was a symbolic and a devastating blow to the Gaelic Christianity, a sign that the old order was crumbling under the assault of the pagan invaders. The specific accounts of the Viking raids on the Hebrides and the western Scotland, which are recorded in the Irish annals, paint a vivid and a horrifying picture of the violence and the destruction that the Norsemen inflicted on the native populations. The annals, which are a series of the yearly entries that record the major events of the time, are filled with the references to the burnings, the plunderings, and the slaughterings of the monasteries and the settlements by the Gentiles. The Annals of Ulster, under the year 794, records the devastation of all the islands of Britain by the Gentiles, a clear reference to the Viking attacks on the Hebrides and the Orkney. The same annals, under the year 798, record the plundering of the Isle of Man and of the Hebrides by the Gentiles, a raid that was part of the wave of the attacks that swept across the Irish Sea. The annals, which are the only contemporary written sources for the early Viking period in Scotland, are a grim chronicle of the terror that the Norsemen inspired in the Christian communities of the islands and the coast. The response of the Picts and the Gaels to the Viking threat was a mixture of the resistance, the accommodation, and the flight. The native rulers, who were the petty kings and the chieftains of the fragmented political landscape of the northern Britain, were slow to react to the new danger, a failure that was due in part to the speed and the unpredictability of the Viking attacks and in part to the internal divisions that plagued the native societies. The Picts, who were the dominant power in the north and the east of Scotland, were initially able to defend their territories, a defense that was based on the formidable fortifications of the Brochs and the hill forts that were scattered across the landscape. The Gaels of Dal Riata, who were the first to bear the brunt of the Viking attacks, were less successful, and their kingdom, which had been the dominant force in the western Scotland for the centuries, was shattered by the Norse onslaught. The annals record the destruction of the Gaelic strongholds, the killing of the kings, and the flight of the survivors, a catastrophe that was the beginning of the end for the independent Gaelic kingdoms of the Hebrides. The specific archaeological evidence for the violence of the Viking conquest is a growing and a compelling body of the data, a record that is written in the burned layers of the settlements, the scattered hoards of the buried treasure, and the mass graves of the victims. The excavations at the Udal, a site on the North Uist in the Hebrides, have revealed a sequence of the settlements that spans from the Iron Age to the medieval period, including a layer of the destruction that is associated with the Viking arrival, a layer of the ash, the burned timbers, and the scattered artifacts that is a silent testimony to the violence of the conquest. The hoards of the silver and the gold that have been found across the Northern Isles, such as the Skull hoard in Orkney, which contained a collection of the Vikings' silver arm rings and the Anglo-Saxon coins, are the evidence of the wealth that was accumulated by the raiders and the settlers, a wealth that was often buried in the times of the danger and never recovered by its owners. The mass graves, which are rare but significant, are the direct evidence of the human cost of the Viking conquest, a cost that was borne primarily by the native Pictish and Gaelic populations. The process of the Viking settlement, which began in the early 9th century and which continued for the several generations, was a gradual and a complex phenomenon that involved the displacement, the absorption, and the integration of the native populations. The early settlers, who were the warriors and the adventurers who had come to the islands in search of the land and the wealth, established the initial footholds, the fortified homesteads that were the bases for the expansion. The later settlers, who were the farmers, the fishermen, and the craftsmen, followed in the wake of the warriors, bringing with them their families, their livestock, and their culture, a process that was the foundation of the permanent Norse presence in the islands. The native populations, who were the Picts and the Gaels, were not entirely exterminated or expelled, but were gradually absorbed into the new Norse society, a process of the acculturation that was facilitated by the intermarriage, the conversion to the Christianity, and the adoption of the Norse language and the customs. The result of this process was the creation of a new, hybrid culture, the Norse-Gaelic culture of the Kingdom of the Isles, a culture that was neither purely Norse nor purely Gaelic, but a unique fusion of the two. The Orkney Islands, which lie just off the northern coast of Scotland, were the strategic heart of the Viking Empire in the North Atlantic, the key to the control of the sea routes that linked the Norway to the Ireland, the Iceland, and the beyond. The Orkney Archipelago, which consists of about 70 islands, of which 20 are inhabited, is a landscape of the contrasts, the fertile, green fields and the rugged, windswept cliffs, the sheltered bays and the treacherous tidal races, a world that was perfectly suited to the needs of the Norse settlers. The main island, which is known simply as the mainland, was the center of the Norse power in the region, the location of the earldom's capital at the Bursey and later, at the Kirkwall, where the magnificent Cathedral of St. Magnus, which was built in the 12th century, still stands as a testament to the Norse legacy. The Orkney Islands, which were the first of the Scottish territories to be fully colonized by the Vikings, were the bridgehead for the Norse expansion into the Scotland, the base from which the Earls of Orkney launched their campaigns of the conquest and the raiding across the Hebrides, the mainland, and the Ireland. The specific history of the Norse conquest of the Orkney is recorded, albeit in a legendary and embellished form, in the Orkneyinga saga, the Saga of the Earls of Orkney, which is the primary narrative source for the history of the islands during the Viking period. The saga, which was written in Iceland in the late 12th or the early 13th century, tells the story of the Earls of Orkney from the 9th to the 12th centuries, a story that is filled with the battles, the feuds, the alliances, and the betrayals that were the stuff of the Norse political life. According to the saga, the conquest of the Orkney was accomplished by the Norwegian king Harald Fairhair, who sailed west in the late 9th century to punish the Viking raiders who were using the islands as a base for their attacks on his kingdom. Harald, who was the first king to unify the Norway, defeated the raiders in a series of the battles and granted the earldom of Orkney to his ally, Ragnvald Eysteinn, the Earl of Moor, as a reward for his loyalty. The saga, which is a blend of the historical fact and the literary invention, is a crucial source for the understanding of the early Norse period in Scotland. The specific archaeological evidence for the Norse settlement of the Orkney is extensive and varied, a record of the material culture that the Vikings brought with them, and that they adapted to the conditions of the islands. The Brath of Barsi, a small tidal island on the northwest coast of the mainland, was the site of the principal Norse settlement in the Orkney, a place that was the residence of the earls and the center of the political and the religious power. The excavations at the Barsi have revealed the remains of the Norse longhouses, the church, and the associated buildings, a complex that was the nucleus of the earldom. The artifacts that have been recovered from the Barsi, including the jewelry, the weapons, the tools, and the everyday household items, are a vivid record of the lives of the Norse elite, a people who were the rulers of the islands and who were the patrons of the arts and the church. The runic inscriptions that have been found at the Barsi, including a stone that bears the name of the Earl Thorfinn the Mighty, are a direct link to the historical figures of the saga, a tangible connection to the world of the Norse earls. The specific figure of Sigurd the Mighty, the first Earl of Orkney according to the saga, is a legendary and enigmatic character, a man who embodies the violence and the ambition of the Viking age. Sigurd, who was the brother of Ragnvald Eysteinn, was granted the earldom by Harald Fairhair after the death of Ragnvald's son, who was killed in the campaign. Sigurd, who was a formidable and a ruthless warrior, extended the power of the Orkney earldom across the northern Scotland, conquering the Caithness, the Sutherland, and the parts of the Ross and the Cromarty, a territory that was known as the Sigurd's earldom. According to the saga, Sigurd met his end in a bizarre and a gruesome manner. After killing the Scottish Earl Maelbrigt, Sigurd tied the severed head to his saddle as a trophy, but the tooth of the dead man scratched his leg, causing a fatal infection. The death of Sigurd the Mighty, which is a classic example of the saga's blend of the history and the legend, is a reminder of the brutal and the precarious nature of the life of the Viking earls. The specific linguistic and the toponymic legacy of the Norse in the Orkney is a powerful and an enduring testimony to the completeness of the Viking colonization. The place names of the Orkney, which are overwhelmingly of the Norse origin, are a record of the landscape that was named by the Viking settlers, a landscape that was divided into the farms, the fields, the bays, and the headlands that were the framework of the Norse society. The names that end in the by farm, the wick, bay, the dale, valley, the ness, headland, and the bister or bster, farmstead, are the classic examples of the Norse toponymy, a language that is still spoken in the names of the places that dot the map of the Orkney. The Norn language, a form of the Old Norse that was spoken in the Orkney and the Shetland until the 18th century, has left a rich vocabulary of the words that describe the landscape, the weather, the farming, and the fishing, a vocabulary that is the living link to the Viking past. The Orkney, which was the heart of the Norse Empire in the Scotland, is still a Norse land, a place where the past is written in the names and the words of the present. Narration for Chapter 06, Create File, Chapter 06.wave. The Shetland Islands, which lie about 80 miles to the northeast of the Orkney, were the first landfall for the Viking ships crossing the North Sea from the western Norway, the gateway to the Scottish archipelago and the rich territories beyond. The Shetland archipelago, which consists of over 100 islands, of which only 15 are inhabited, is a landscape of the stark and the dramatic beauty, the barren, peat-covered hills and the deeply indented coastline, a world that was shaped by the wind and the sea. The main island, which is known as the mainland, was the center of the Norse settlement in the Shetland, the location of the principal farms and the political assembly, the Thing, which was held at the Lawtingholm, a small promontory on the Loch of Tingwall. The Shetland Islands, which were even more remote and more isolated than the Orkney, were a pure Norse colony, a place where the native Pictish population was almost entirely replaced by the Scandinavian settlers, a process that is reflected in the place names, the language, and the genetics of the modern Shetlanders. The specific archaeological evidence for the Norse settlement of the Shetland is, as we have noted, exemplified by the remarkable site of the Jarlshof, on the southern tip of the mainland, a place that has been continuously inhabited for over 4,000 years. The Norse settlement at the Jarlshof, which dates from the 9th to the 13th centuries, is a complex of the longhouses, the outbuildings, and the workshops that were the home of a prosperous farming and fishing community. The longhouses, which were built of the stone and the turf, with the central hearths and the benches along the walls, are the classic examples of the Viking domestic architecture, a design that was well suited to the harsh climate of the Shetland. The artifacts that have been recovered from the Jarlshof, including the soapstone vessels, the bone combs, the iron tools, and the bronze jewelry, are a vivid record of the lives of the Norse settlers, a people who were the skilled craftsmen and the traders, and who were connected to the wider world of the Viking diaspora. The specific political status of the Shetland within the Norse earldom of Orkney is a subject of some debate, but it is clear that the islands were an integral part of the earldom from the time of the conquest, a dependency that was ruled by the earls from their base in the Orkney. The Shetland, which was known to the Norsemen as the Jutland, a name that may derive from the Old Norse word for the hilt of a sword, a reference to the shape of the islands, was a source of the tribute, the taxes, and the military service for the earls, a valuable asset that contributed to the wealth and the power of the earldom. The Thing at the Tingwall, which was the assembly of the free men of the Shetland, was the local expression of the Norse system of the law and the governance, a system that was based on the participation of the community and the authority of the law. The Shetland, which was a remote and an isolated outpost of the Norse world, was a functioning and a self-governing society, a testament to the resilience and the adaptability of the Viking culture. The specific linguistic legacy of the Norse in the Shetland is even more pronounced than in the Orkney, a fact that is due to the greater isolation of the islands and the near-complete replacement of the native Pictish population. The Norn language, which was spoken in the Shetland until the late 18th century, was a direct descendant of the Old Norse, a language that had evolved in the isolation of the islands and that had developed its own distinctive features. The Norn, which was the everyday speech of the Shetlanders for over 800 years, was gradually replaced by the Scots and the English after the islands were annexed by the Scotland in the 15th century, but it left a rich legacy of the words, the phrases, and the grammatical structures that are still used in the Shetlandic dialect today. The Shetlandic words for the everyday objects, the natural features, and the agricultural practices are often of the Norse origin, a linguistic fingerprint that is the evidence of the deep and the lasting impact of the Viking settlement. The specific cultural traditions of the Shetland, which are the legacy of the Norse settlement, are still celebrated in the islands today, a living connection to the Viking past. The Upphelgø, the Great Fire Festival that is held in the Lerwick on the last Tuesday of the January, is a spectacular and a dramatic reenactment of the Viking past, a procession of the Geysers, the costumed participants, who carry the torches and who drag a replica of a Viking longship through the streets, before setting it alight in a blaze of the flame and the smoke. The Upphelgø, which was first celebrated in its modern form in the 1880s, is a powerful and an emotional expression of the Shetlandic identity, a celebration of the Norse heritage that is the foundation of the island culture. The Shetland, which was the first landfall for the Viking ships, is still a Norse land, a place where the fire of the past is kept alive in the hearts of the present. The Hebrides, the long chain of the islands that stretches from the Lewis in the north to the Islay in the south, were the heartland of the Norse-Gaelic kingdom that would come to be known as the Kingdom of the Isles, a realm that was the product of the fusion of the Viking and the Gaelic cultures that occurred in the centuries after the initial conquest. The Hebrides, which were known to the Norsemen as the Shurijar, the Southern Isles, to distinguish them from the Norijar, the Northern Isles, of Orkney and Shetland, were a world of the contrasts, the rugged, mountainous interiors and the fertile, green coastal strips, the sheltered sea locks and the exposed, windswept headlands. The islands, which were the most heavily settled of the Scottish territories by the Vikings, were the base for the expansion of the Norse power into the Irish Sea, the Isle of Man, and the coasts of the Ireland and the Wales. The Kingdom of the Isles, which was ruled by a dynasty of the Norse-Gaelic sea kings, was a formidable and a lasting political entity, a realm that was the dominant force in the Western Seaways for over 4 centuries. The specific process of the Norse settlement of the Hebrides, which began in the early 9th century and which continued for the several generations, was a complex and a multifaceted phenomenon that involved the conquest, the colonization, the intermarriage, and the cultural fusion. The early raids, which were the initial phase of the contact, were followed by the establishment of the permanent settlements, the farmsteads and the villages that were the nuclei of the Norse presence. The native Gaelic population, which was the dominant culture of the Hebrides before the Viking arrival, was not entirely displaced or exterminated, but was gradually absorbed into the new Norse society, a process that was facilitated by the intermarriage and the adoption of the Norse language and the customs. The result of this process was the emergence of the Gael, the foreigner Gaels, a mixed population that was the product of the fusion of the Norse and the Gaelic cultures, a people who spoke both the languages, who practiced both the Christianity and the pagan traditions, and who were the subjects of the sea kings of the Isles. The specific archaeological evidence for the Norse settlement of the Hebrides is extensive and varied, a record that includes the settlements, the cemeteries, the hoards, and the individual artifacts that are the material remains of the Viking presence. The settlement at the Udal, on the north-west, which we have already mentioned, is one of the most important of the Norse sites in the Hebrides, a place that was continuously inhabited from the Iron Age to the medieval period and that provides a unique record of the transition from the native to the Norse culture. The pagan Norse graves, which have been found across the Hebrides, including the warrior burials with the weapons, the tools, and the personal ornaments, are the evidence of the early phase of the settlement, a phase that was characterized by the retention of the traditional Norse beliefs and the practices. The later Christian graves, which are marked by the cross slabs and the other Christian symbols, are the evidence of the conversion and the integration of the Norse settlers into the wider Christian community of the Hebrides. The specific political history of the Kingdom of the Isles, which is a complex and often confusing narrative of the dynastic feuds, the alliances, and the wars, is recorded in a variety of the sources, including the Irish Annals, the Norse sagas, and the later Scottish and the English chronicles. The kingdom, which was founded by the Norse warlords of the 9th century, was a loose and a fluctuating entity, a confederation of the island lords who owed a nominal allegiance to a high king, but who were often in the rebellion or the war with each other. The most famous of the sea kings was Godred Crovan, who ruled from the 1079 to the 1095 and who established the dynasty that would dominate the Isles for the next 2 centuries. Godred, who was a brilliant and a ruthless leader, conquered the Isle of Man, the Hebrides, and the Dublin, creating a maritime empire that was the terror of the Irish Sea. The Kingdom of the Isles, which was the product of the Viking expansion, was a unique and a fascinating political entity, a realm that was the bridge between the Norse and the Gaelic worlds. The specific cultural and the linguistic legacy of the Norse in the Hebrides is a rich and a complex tapestry, a blend of the Scandinavian and the Gaelic elements that is the distinctive heritage of the islands. The place names of the Hebrides, which are a mixture of the Norse and the Gaelic, are a record of the settlement history, a map of the linguistic landscape that was created by the Viking colonization. The names that begin with the Skerry, the Bog, Bay, the Eilean, Island, and the Ruba, Headland, are the Norse loanwords that have been incorporated into the Gaelic, a linguistic fusion that is the reflection of the cultural fusion of the islands. The Gaelic language, which is still spoken in the Hebrides today, contains a significant number of the Norse loanwords, particularly in the vocabulary of the seafaring, the fishing, and the agriculture, a testament to the deep and the lasting impact of the Viking settlement on the culture of the islands. The Hebrides, which were the heartland of the Norse-Gaelic kingdom, are still a living museum of the Viking age, a place where the echoes of the past can be heard in the language of the present. The mainland of Scotland, the rugged and the mountainous territory that was the heartland of the Pictish and the Gaelic kingdoms, was also the target of the Viking expansion, a process that began with the coastal raids and that eventually led to the establishment of the permanent Norse settlements along the northern and the western seaboards. The Vikings, who were the masters of the sea, were initially reluctant to venture far inland, preferring to strike at the coastal targets from the safety of their ships. But as the pressure on the land in the Scandinavia increased, and as the opportunities for the plunder in the coastal regions diminished, the Norsemen began to push inland, following the rivers and the sea locks that led into the heart of the Pictish and the Gaelic territories. The mainland of the Scotland, which was a patchwork of the warring kingdoms and the tribal confederations, was a tempting and a vulnerable target, a land that was ripe for the conquest and the settlement. The specific regions of the mainland that were most heavily affected by the Viking incursions were the Caithness, the Sutherland, the Ross and Cromarty, and the Argyll, the territories that were closest to the Norse bases in the Orkney, the Shetland, and the Hebrides. The Caithness, which is the northeastern corner of the Scottish mainland, was the first of the mainland territories to be conquered by the Vikings, a process that was led by the Earls of Orkney, who extended their power across the Pentland Firth and established a Norse-speaking colony that would persist for the centuries. The Sutherland, which is the territory to the south of the Caithness, was also the subject of the Norse colonization, a process that is reflected in the place names and the archaeology of the region. The Ross and Cromarty, which lie to the west of the Sutherland, were the scene of the repeated Viking raids, and the Norse settlements were established along the shores of the Cromarty Firth and the Moray Firth. The Argyll, which is the heartland of the old Gaelic kingdom of Dalriada, was heavily settled by the Norse, a process that contributed to the fusion of the Norse and the Gaelic cultures that produced the Gaul Gaedhil. The specific archaeological evidence for the Viking presence on the Scottish mainland is less extensive than in the Northern and the Western Isles, a fact that is due to the more dispersed nature of the settlement and the subsequent development of the regions. But the evidence that does exist, including the pagan graves, the silver hoards, and the isolated artifacts, is a clear indication of the Norse presence and the Norse influence. The pagan grave at the Balnachail, near the Durness in the Sutherland, which contained the skeleton of a man who was buried with his sword, his shield, and his other weapons, is a classic example of the Viking warrior burial, a ritual that was practiced by the early Norse settlers before their conversion to the Christianity. The silver hoard that was found at the Skyle in the Orkney, which we have already mentioned, is another example of the wealth that was accumulated by the Viking raiders and the settlers, a wealth that was often buried in the times of the danger. The isolated artifacts, such as the Viking sword that was found in the River Tay at the Perth, are the random but significant reminders of the Norse presence across the mainland. The specific political impact of the Viking incursions on the mainland of the Scotland was a factor in the unification of the Pictish and the Gaelic kingdoms under a single ruler, a process that culminated in the rise of the dynasty of the Kenneth MacAlpin in the mid-9th century. The Vikings, who had shattered the old Gaelic kingdom of Dalriada and who were pressing hard on the Pictish territories, created a power vacuum that was filled by the ambitious and the capable rulers who were able to unite the remaining forces of the Picts and the Gaels against the common enemy. Kenneth MacAlpin, who was the king of the Dalriada and who claimed the Pictish throne through his mother, was the first of the unified kings of the Scots, a ruler who is traditionally regarded as the founder of the medieval Scottish kingdom. The pressure of the Viking attacks, which had been a catastrophe for the individual kingdoms, was a catalyst for the creation of the unified Scottish state. The specific linguistic and the toponymic evidence for the Norse presence on the Scottish mainland is, as elsewhere, a powerful and enduring testimony to the scale and the impact of the Viking colonization. The place names of the Caithness, the Sutherland, and the other regions that were affected by the Norse settlement are filled with the Norse elements, the names that end in the bster, farm, the dale, valley, the ness, headland, and the Wick Bay, a linguistic landscape that is the direct descendant of the Viking Age. The dialect of the Scots that is spoken in the Caithness and the other Norse-influenced regions contains a significant number of the words of the Norse origin, a lexical legacy that is the living link to the Viking past. The Vikings, who were the settlers and the conquerors of the mainland, left their mark on the language and the culture of the region, a mark that is the evidence of their enduring presence and their lasting influence. The specific process of the cultural fusion between the Norse and the native Pictish and Gaelic peoples, which was the defining feature of the Viking Age in the Scotland, was a complex and a multi-generational phenomenon that involved the intermarriage, the language shift, the religious conversion, and the political integration. The initial phase of the contact, which was characterized by the violence and the destruction, was gradually replaced by a period of the coexistence and the mutual accommodation, a process that was driven by the practical needs of the daily life and the shared interests of the settlers and the natives. The Norse settlers, who were the farmers, the fishermen, and the traders, needed the labor and the knowledge of the native populations, who were familiar with the land and the local conditions. The native populations, who were the Picts and the Gaels, needed the protection and the access to the trade networks that the Norse overlords could provide. The result of this mutual dependency was the gradual blurring of the boundaries between the two communities, a process that was the foundation of the Norse-Gaelic culture. The specific evidence for the intermarriage between the Norse and the native peoples is a combination of the genetic, the linguistic, and the literary sources, a body of the evidence that is consistent and compelling. The genetic studies of the modern populations of the Northern and the Western Isles, which we have already discussed, have revealed a pattern of the mixed ancestry that is the result of the intermarriage between the Norsemen and the native women, a pattern that is consistent with the historical accounts of the Viking colonization. The linguistic evidence, which is the presence of the Gaelic loanwords in the Old Norse and the Norse loanwords in the Gaelic, is a reflection of the bilingualism and the cultural exchange that were the products of the intermarriage and the coexistence. The literary sources, particularly the Norse sagas and the Irish annals, contain the numerous references to the marriages between the Norse leaders and the native women, unions that were often the means of sealing the political alliances and the consolidating the power. The intermarriage, which was a common feature of the Viking expansion across the Europe, was a crucial factor in the creation of the hybrid Norse-Gaelic society of the Scotland. The specific process of the religious conversion of the Norse settlers into Scotland, which was a gradual and an uneven phenomenon, was a crucial factor in the cultural fusion and the integration of the two communities. The Vikings, who were the pagans when they first arrived in the Scotland, brought with them a complex and a rich mythology, a pantheon of the gods and the goddesses, Odin, Thor, Freya, and the others, who were the objects of the worship and the sacrifice. The early settlers, who were the warriors and the adventurers, were the most resistant to the conversion, clinging to the traditional beliefs that were the foundation of their identity and their culture. But as the settlement became more established, and as the Norse communities became more integrated into the Christian society of the Scotland, the pressure for the conversion increased, a process that was driven by the influence of the native wives, the political calculations of the leaders, and the missionary activity of the Church. The conversion of the Norse, which was largely complete by the end of the 10th century, was a watershed event, a moment that marked the final integration of the Viking settlers into the Christian community of the Scotland. The specific political integration of the Norse settlers into the emerging Scottish kingdom was a process that unfolded over the course of the 10th and the 11th centuries, a process that was marked by the conflicts, the alliances, and the gradual absorption of the Norse territories into the orbit of the Scottish crown. The Earls of Orkney, who were the most powerful of the Norse rulers in Scotland, maintained their independence for the centuries, but they were increasingly drawn into the politics of the Scottish kingdom, a process that was accelerated by the dynastic marriages and the military alliances. The Kingdom of the Isles, which was the other major Norse political entity in Scotland, was a rival and an occasional ally of the Scottish kings, a realm that was the last bastion of the independent Norse power in the region. The final absorption of the Norse territories into the Scottish kingdom, which was accomplished by the Treaty of Perth in 1266, was the end of the Viking Age in Scotland, a moment that marked the triumph of the centralized, feudal state over the fragmented, maritime lordships of the Sea Kings. The specific legacy of the cultural fusion between the Norse and the Gaels is the rich and the vibrant culture of the Highlands and the Islands, a culture that is the product of the centuries of the mixing and the blending of the two traditions. The clan system, which was the dominant form of the social organization in the Highlands from the medieval period onward, is a product of this fusion, a system that combined the Norse emphasis on the kinship and the personal loyalty with the Gaelic traditions of the tribal authority and the hereditary landholding. The Highland bagpipe, which is the quintessential symbol of the Scottish identity, may have its origins in the instruments that were brought to the Scotland by the Viking settlers, a legacy that is the testament to the cultural exchange of the Viking Age. The Gaelic language, which is still spoken in the Highlands and the Islands, is a repository of the Norse loanwords, a linguistic record of the fusion that is the foundation of the Scottish identity. The blood of the Vikings, which was mixed with the blood of the Picts and the Gaels, flows in the veins of the modern Scots, a permanent and a living legacy of the Norse invasion of the Scotland. The specific role of the Norse settlers in the development of the maritime trade and the economy of the Scotland is a crucial and often overlooked aspect of the Viking legacy, a contribution that was the foundation of the prosperity and the growth of the region during the medieval period. The Vikings, who were the masters of the sea, had a profound impact on the trade routes and the commercial networks of the North Atlantic, an impact that transformed the isolated and the subsistence economy of the Scotland into a dynamic and an interconnected part of the European and the Scandinavian trading system. The Norse settlers, who were the farmers, the fishermen, the craftsmen, and the merchants, were the agents of this transformation, a people who brought with them the skills, the knowledge, and the capital that were necessary for the development of the trade and the industry. The archaeological evidence for the Norse trade in the Scotland, which includes the imported goods, the coins, and the manufacturing debris, is a testament to the scale and the importance of the Viking commercial activity. The specific trade routes that the Vikings established in the Scotland were a network of the sea lanes and the overland tracks that connected the northern and the western isles to the markets of the Scandinavia, the Ireland, the England, and the continent. The Orkney and the Shetland, which were the hubs of the Norse trade in the North Atlantic, were the centers for the collection and the distribution of the goods that were produced in the islands and the mainland. The exports of the Norse Scotland included the wool, the hides, the fish, the walrus ivory, the falcons, and the slaves, the commodities that were in the high demand in the markets of the Europe and the East. The imports, which included the wine, the silk, the spices, the pottery, the glass, and the metalwork, were the luxury goods that were the symbols of the wealth and the status of the Norse elite. The trade routes, which were the arteries of the Norse economy, were the channels through which the goods, the ideas, and the people flowed, a network that was the foundation of the medieval Scottish prosperity. The specific manufacturing industries that the Vikings developed in the Scotland, which were based on the local resources and the imported raw materials, were a significant part of the Norse economy and a source of the employment and the income for the settlers. The soapstone, which is a soft, easily carved stone that is found in the Shetland and the other parts of the Scotland, was a valuable material that was used for the making of the cooking pots, the lamps, the loom weights, and the other household items, a craft that was practiced by the Norse artisans and that produced the goods for the local use and the export. The iron production, which was based on the bog iron that was found in the Hebrides and the other regions, was another important industry, a process that required the skilled labor and the significant amounts of the charcoal, a resource that was provided by the extensive woodlands of the Scotland. The woolen cloth, which was woven on the upright looms that were the standard equipment of the Norse households, was a major export, a commodity that was prized for its quality and its durability in the markets of the Europe. The specific coinage and the monetary economy of the Norse Scotland is a complex and a fascinating subject, a reflection of the integration of the region into the wider European economy and the gradual transition from the bullion to the coin-based transactions. The early Viking period, which was characterized by the raiding and the plunder, was a time when the wealth was measured in the silver bullion, the ingots and the arm rings that were the portable and the divisible form of the currency. The hoards of the silver that have been found across the Scotland, which contained a mixture of the coins, the ingots, and the hack silver, the fragments of the silver objects that were cut up for the use as the currency, are the evidence of this bullion economy, an economy that was based on the weight and the purity of the metal. The later period, which saw the establishment of the mints in the Norse territories, including the mint at the Dublin that served the Kingdom of the Isles, was a time of the increasing monetization, a process that was driven by the needs of the trade and the taxation. The coins that were produced by the Norse mints, which were often the imitations of the Anglo-Saxon and the other European models, are the evidence of the integration of the Norse Scotland into the commercial networks of the medieval Europe. The specific legacy of the Norse trade and the economy in the Scotland is the foundation of the modern commercial and the industrial prosperity of the region, a legacy that is the result of the centuries of the development that began with the Viking settlement. The ports and the harbors that were established by the Vikings, such as the Lerwick in the Shetland, the Kirkwall in the Orkney, and the Stornoway in the Lewis, are still the centers of the maritime trade and the fishing industry, a continuity that spans over 1,000 years. The traditional industries of the northern and the western isles, such as the wool production, the fishing, and the crafts, are the direct descendants of the Norse manufacturing, a living link to the Viking past. The Norse trade, which was the engine of the medieval economy, is the invisible foundation of the modern Scottish prosperity, a legacy that is the true treasure of the Viking age. The specific military organization and the tactics of the Norse forces that conquered and colonized the Scotland were the product of a warrior culture that was unique in the early medieval Europe, a culture that was based on the values of the honor, the loyalty, and the personal courage, and that was expressed in the institutions of the herd, the war band, and the Leanger, the naval levy. The Viking warrior, who was the product of this culture, was a formidable and a versatile fighter, a man who was skilled in the use of the sword, the axe, the spear, and the bow, and who was equally at home on the deck of a longship or in the shield wall of a land battle. The Norse military system, which was the instrument of the conquest and the colonization of the Scotland, was a fusion of the traditional Germanic warfare and the specific adaptations to the conditions of the sea and the amphibious operations, a system that was the key to the Viking success. The specific equipment of the Viking warrior, which is known from the archaeological finds and the descriptions in the sagas, was a combination of the offensive and the defensive arms that were the products of the skilled metalworking tradition of the Scandinavia. The sword, which was the most prized and the most expensive of the weapons, was a double-edged blade that was often decorated with the inlaid patterns and the inscriptions, a work of art that was the symbol of the warrior's status and his prowess. The axe, which was the common weapon of the ordinary warrior, was a versatile and a deadly tool, capable of delivering a crushing blow that could shatter the shields and the helmets of the enemy. The spear, which was the weapon of the shield wall, was a long, thrusting weapon that was used to hold the enemy at the bay and to break the formations. The bow, which was the weapon of the hunters and the sailors, was a long-range weapon that was used to harass the enemy and to pick off the individual targets. The defensive equipment, which included the round shield, the iron helmet, and the mail shirt, was the protection that allowed the Viking warrior to survive the chaos of the battle. The specific tactics of the Viking forces, which were the key to their success against the often larger and the better equipped armies of the native kingdoms, were based on the principles of the surprise, the mobility, and the concentration of the force. The Viking raid, which was the classic form of the Norse warfare, was a sudden and a violent attack on an undefended target, a strike that was delivered from the sea by a force of the warriors who had landed on the coast, and who were gone before the local forces could be mobilized. The amphibious assault, which was the hallmark of the Viking operations, was a complex and a risky maneuver that required the close coordination of the ships and the troops, a skill that the Norsemen had perfected over the generations. The shield wall, which was the standard formation of the Viking infantry, was a dense line of the warriors who stood shoulder to shoulder, their shields overlapping, a formation that was almost impenetrable to the enemy attack, and that was the basis of the Norse defensive and offensive tactics. The specific role of the naval power in the Viking conquest of the Scotland was the decisive factor, a fact that is a reflection of the importance of the sea in the Norse culture and the military thinking. The longship, which we have already described, was the instrument of the naval power, a vessel that was capable of carrying the warriors and the supplies across the vast distances of the North Atlantic, and of landing them on the hostile shores. The Leanger, the naval levy, was the system of the mobilization that allowed the Norse kings and the earls to raise the large fleets for the major expeditions, a system that was based on the obligation of the free men to provide the ships and the crews for the defense of the realm. The naval power of the Vikings, which was the foundation of their dominance of the northern and the western isles, was the key to their ability to project the force across the sea and to control the maritime trade routes. The specific legacy of the Viking military tradition in Scotland is the martial culture of the Highlands and the Islands, a culture that was the product of the fusion of the Norse and the Gaelic fighting traditions. The Highland warrior, who was the descendant of the Viking and the Gael, was a formidable and a feared figure, a man who was skilled in the use of the broadsword, the dirk, and the targe, and who was driven by a fierce code of the honor and the loyalty to his clan and his chief. The Highland charge, which was the classic tactic of the clan warfare, was a sudden and a ferocious rush that was designed to break the enemy line with the shock and the momentum, a tactic that was the direct descendant of the Viking assault. The martial spirit of the Highlands, which was the legacy of the Norse and the Gaelic ancestors, is a permanent part of the Scottish identity, a spirit that was forged in the fires of the Viking Age. The specific social and the legal institutions of the Norse settlers in Scotland, which were the foundation of their political and their cultural identity, were a sophisticated and a complex system that was based on the principles of the personal freedom, the communal responsibility, and the rule of the law. The Norse society, which was organized around the household, the farm, and the local assembly, the Thing, was a world that was very different from the hierarchical and the feudal society of the medieval Europe, a world where the free men had a voice in the decisions that affected their lives and where the law was the supreme authority that bound all the members of the community. The Norse legal and the social institutions, which were brought to Scotland by the settlers and which were adapted to the local conditions, were a crucial part of the Viking legacy, a legacy that has shaped the political and the legal culture of the region for the centuries. The specific structure of the Norse household, which was the basic unit of the society, was a self-sufficient and a largely autonomous entity, a farm that was owned and operated by a free man, the Bondi, and his family. The household, which was known as the Byr or the Bulstar, was the center of the economic, the social, and the religious life of the Norse community, a place where the family lived, worked, and worshipped. The head of the household, the husbandi, had the authority over his wife, his children, and his servants, but he was also bound by the law and the custom to provide for their welfare and to protect their rights. The women of the Norse household, who were the husfrida, the lady of the house, had a significant and a respected role, a role that included the management of the domestic affairs, the supervision of the servants, and the custody of the keys to the storehouses, a symbol of their authority. The Norse household, which was the foundation of the society, was a resilient and adaptable institution, a model that was well suited to the conditions of the Scottish Islands and the coast. The specific institution of the Thing, the local assembly of the free men, was the cornerstone of the Norse political and the legal system, a forum where the disputes were resolved, the laws were made, and the important decisions were taken by the community. The Thing, which was held at the designated places, often the ancient mounds or the stone circles that were the sacred sites of the pre-Christian religion, was a gathering of the free men of the district, who met at the regular intervals to discuss the matters of the common interest. The Thing was presided over by the Lgskummer, the law speaker, a man who was the repository of the oral law and who was responsible for the reciting of the legal code from the memory, a task that required the immense learning and the authority. The Thing, which was the expression of the Norse concept of the self-government and the rule of the law, was a unique and a precious institution, a model that has been compared to the early parliaments and the assemblies of the later democratic tradition. The specific legal code that governed the Norse society in Scotland, which was known as the Gulathing Law or the Frostathing Law, after the names of the main things in the Norway, was a comprehensive and a detailed body of the law that covered every aspect of the life, from the inheritance and the property to the marriage and the crime. The law, which was the product of the centuries of the evolution and the codification, was a sophisticated and a rational system, a system that was based on the principles of the compensation, the restitution, and the restoration of the balance, rather than the punishment and the retribution. The blood feud, which was the traditional method of settling the disputes in the pre-state societies, was regulated and limited by the law, a system that was designed to prevent the endless cycle of the violence and to provide the peaceful means of resolving the conflicts. The Norse legal system, which was the foundation of the order and the justice in the Viking society, was a remarkable achievement, a legacy that is the ancestor of the modern legal traditions of Scotland and the Scandinavia. The specific legacy of the Norse social and the legal institutions in Scotland is the distinctive character of the Highlands and the Islands, a character that is defined by the values of the independence, the self-reliance, and the respect for the law. The clan system, which was the dominant form of the social organization in the Highlands for the centuries, was a fusion of the Norse and the Gaelic traditions, a system that combined the Norse emphasis on the kinship and the personal loyalty with the Gaelic traditions of the tribal authority and the hereditary landholding. The Scottish legal system, which is a unique blend of the Roman law, the feudal law, and the customary law, has been influenced by the Norse legal traditions, a legacy that is the testament to the enduring impact of the Viking settlement. The Norse social and the legal institutions, which were brought to the Scotland by the Viking settlers, are the invisible foundation of the modern Scottish society, a foundation that is the true and the lasting treasure of the Viking Age. The specific religious transformation of the Norse settlers in Scotland, from the paganism to the Christianity, was a gradual and a complex process that unfolded over the course of the 10th and the 11th centuries, a process that was the result of the interaction of the internal and the external factors, the personal conversions of the leaders, the influence of the native wives, the missionary activity of the church, and the political calculations of the rulers. The conversion, which was a watershed event in the history of the Norse Scotland, marked the end of the old pagan world and the beginning of the integration of the Viking settlers into the Christian civilization of the Europe. The pagan religion of the Vikings, which was a rich and a complex mythology that was centered on the worship of the gods and the goddesses, Odin, the All-Father, the god of the wisdom and the war, Thor, the thunderer, the protector of the humans and the slayer of the giants, Freya, the goddess of the love and the fertility, and the many other deities who inhabited the Norse cosmos, was a faith that was deeply embedded in the culture and the identity of the Norse people. The conversion, which required the abandonment of the old gods and the acceptance of the new, was a traumatic and a difficult process, a process that was resisted by many and that was accomplished only gradually. The specific evidence for the pagan religion of the Norse in the Scotland is a combination of the archaeological finds, the literary sources, and the place names, a body of the evidence that is a window into the spiritual world of the Viking settlers. The pagan graves, which are the most direct and the most personal evidence of the religious beliefs, are the burials of the individuals who were interred with the grave goods, the weapons, the tools, the jewelry, and the food that were the provision for the afterlife, a practice that was the characteristic of the Norse paganism. The boat burials, which are the most spectacular of the pagan graves, are the interments of the high-status individuals in the ships, a ritual that was the symbol of the journey to the other world, a practice that is known from the famous sites such as the Oseberg and the Gokstad in Norway. The place names that refer to the pagan deities, such as the Thurso, Thor's river, and the Odinstone, Odin's stone, are the evidence of the sacred sites and the cult practices of the Norse religion, a landscape that was once filled with the temples and the shrines of the old gods. The specific process of the conversion, which was led by the Norse kings and the earls who had been converted, often as the result of the political alliances and the personal experiences, was a top-down affair that was imposed on the general population by the authority of the rulers. The conversion of the Orkney Earl Sigurd the Stout, who was forced to accept the baptism by the Norwegian king Olaf Tryggvason in 995, was a typical example of this process, a conversion that was the result of the political pressure and the military threat rather than the genuine spiritual conviction. The conversion of the Kingdom of the Isles, which was the result of the influence of the Irish and the Scottish Church, was a more gradual and a more organic process, a process that was driven by the interaction of the Norse settlers and the native Christian populations. The conversion, which was a complex and a varied phenomenon, was the end of the pagan age and the beginning of the Christian era in the Norse Scotland. The specific legacy of the conversion is the rich and the distinctive Christian culture of the Northern and the Western Isles, a culture that is the product of the fusion of the Norse and the Gaelic traditions, and that is expressed in the art, the architecture, and the literature of the region. The stone crosses and the cross slabs that are found across the Hebrides and the other Norse settled areas, including the magnificent Kildalton cross on the Islay, are a unique and a beautiful form of the Christian art, a fusion of the Norse and the Celtic styles that is the visual expression of the cultural fusion of the Viking Age. The Cathedral of St. Magnus in the Kirkwall, which was built in the 12th century by the Norse Earl Ragnvald Kalli Kolsson in honor of his martyred uncle, is a masterpiece of the Romanesque architecture, a building that is the symbol of the Christian faith and the Norse heritage of the Orkney. The Orkneyinga Saga, which was written in the Iceland in the 12th or the 13th century, is a Christian work that is filled with the stories of the pagan past, a fusion of the old and the new that is the characteristic of the Norse-Gaelic literature. The conversion, which was the end of the old gods, was the beginning of a new and a vibrant Christian culture, a culture that is the enduring legacy of the Viking Age in the Scotland. The specific political evolution of the Norse territories in the Scotland, which culminated in the absorption of the earldom of Orkney and the kingdom of the Isles into the Scottish kingdom, was a long and a complex process that spanned the centuries from the 11th to the 13th centuries, a process that was driven by the dynastic conflicts, the military campaigns, and the diplomatic negotiations between the Norse, the Scottish, and the Norwegian rulers. The Norse earldom of Orkney, which was the oldest and the most powerful of the Norse polities in the Scotland, was a sovereign entity that was formally under the suzerainty of the Norwegian crown, a relationship that was often the source of the tension and the conflict between the earls and the kings. The Kingdom of the Isles, which was the other major Norse polity, was an independent and an often rebellious realm that was ruled by the Sea Kings, who were the descendants of the god Crovin, a dynasty that maintained its independence by the skillful playing off of the Scottish and the Norwegian powers against each other. The political evolution of the Norse Scotland was a complex and a fascinating game of the power and the ambition, a game that was ultimately won by the Scottish kings. The specific figure of Thorfinn the Mighty, the Earl of Orkney from about 1014 to 1065, is a central character in the political history of the Norse Scotland, a ruler who embodied the ambition, the ruthlessness, and the achievement of the Viking Age. Thorfinn, who was the grandson of the Scottish King Malcolm II through his mother, was a formidable and a successful ruler, a man who extended the power of the Orkney earldom to its greatest extent, a realm that included the Orkney, the Shetland, the Hebrides, the Caithness, the Sutherland, and the parts of the Ireland and the Isle of Man. Thorfinn, who was a patron of the church and a builder of the churches, was also a Christian ruler, a man who made the pilgrimage to the Rome and who established the bishopric of the Orkney, a step that was crucial in the integration of the earldom into the Christian community of the Europe. The reign of Thorfinn the Mighty, which was the apogee of the Norse power in the Scotland, was the golden age of the earldom of Orkney. The specific decline of the Norse power in the Scotland, which began in the late 12th century and which accelerated in the 13th century, was the result of a combination of the internal and the external factors, the dynastic strife, the economic pressures, and the growing power of the Scottish kingdom. The earldom of Orkney, which had been weakened by the succession disputes and the civil wars, was increasingly drawn into the orbit of the Scottish monarchy, a process that was accelerated by the marriages of the Norse earls to the Scottish princesses and the growing influence of the Scottish nobles and the clergy in the islands. The Kingdom of the Isles, which had been a formidable and an independent power for the centuries, was also in the decline, a victim of the internal divisions, the Viking raids from the Ireland, and the pressure from the Scottish and the Norwegian kings. The Battle of Largs in 1263, which was a skirmish between the forces of the Norwegian King Haakon IV and the Scottish army, was the symbolic end of the Norse power in the Scotland, a battle that was followed by the Treaty of Perth in 1266, which formally ceded the Hebrides and the Isle of Man to the Scottish crown. The specific terms of the Treaty of Perth, which was signed on July 2, 1266, were a comprehensive and a definitive settlement of the long-running dispute between the Scotland and the Norway over the sovereignty of the Norse territories in the Scotland. The treaty, which was negotiated by the representatives of the Scottish King Alexander III and the Norwegian King Magnus VI, provided for the cession of the Hebrides and the Isle of Man to the Scotland in return for the payment of the 4,000 marks of the silver, a substantial sum that was the compensation for the loss of the Norwegian territories. The treaty also provided for the retention of the Orkney and the Shetland by the Norway, a provision that was the recognition of the long-standing Norse presence in the Northern Isles and that was the basis of the continued Norwegian sovereignty over the islands until the 15th century. The Treaty of Perth, which was the formal end of the Viking Age in the Scotland, was a diplomatic masterpiece, a settlement that was the result of the patient and the skillful negotiation and that was the foundation of the lasting peace between the two kingdoms. The specific legacy of the political evolution of the Norse Scotland is the modern political and the territorial structure of the region, a structure that is the result of the centuries of the conflict and the consolidation that began with the Viking invasions. The Orkney and the Shetland, which were the last of the Norse territories to be absorbed into the Scotland, were finally annexed by the Scottish Crown in 1468 and 1469, respectively, as the result of the marriage of the James III of Scotland to the Margaret of Denmark, a union that was the end of the Norwegian sovereignty over the Northern Isles. The Hebrides and the other Norse settled areas of the mainland, which had been integrated into the Scottish kingdom in the 13th century, were the foundations of the modern Scotland, a kingdom that was the product of the fusion of the Pictish, the Gaelic, the Norse, and the Anglo-Norman cultures. The political evolution of the Norse Scotland, which was a long and a complex process, is the story of the creation of the modern Scotland, a story that is the permanent and the enduring legacy of the Viking Age. The story of the Viking invasion of the Scotland and the colonization of the Northern and the Western Isles is, in the final analysis, a story of the transformation, a story of how a wave of the violence and the destruction was the prelude to a profound and a lasting cultural fusion, a fusion that created a unique and a vibrant society that is the foundation of the modern Scottish identity. The Vikings, who came as the raiders and the destroyers, became the settlers and the builders, the men who cleared the land, built the farms, established the trade routes, and founded the political and the legal institutions that would shape the region for the centuries. The Picts and the Gaels, who were the victims of the initial onslaught, were not entirely destroyed or expelled, but were gradually absorbed into the new Norse-Gaelic society, a process that was the result of the intermarriage, the conversion, and the mutual accommodation. The legacy of the Viking Age in the Scotland, which is written in the DNA, the language, the place names, the archaeology, and the culture of the region, is a permanent and an enduring testament to the power of the human capacity for the adaptation, the resilience, and the creation. We have journeyed together through the history of this remarkable transformation, from the first Viking raids on the monasteries of the Hebrides and the Iona in the late 8th century to the final absorption of the Norse territories into the Scottish kingdom in the 13th century, from the archaeology of the Jarlshof and the Bursey to the sagas of the Earls of Orkney and the Sea Kings of the Isles. From the genetics of the modern islanders to the language and the place names of the Norse legacy. From the pagan graves and the silver hoards to the Christian crosses and the cathedrals of the Romanesque style. The story of the Viking invasion of the Scotland is a story that is both a tragedy and a triumph, a story of the violence and the destruction that was the prelude to the creation of a new and a lasting society. The Kingdom of the Isles, the sprawling maritime realm that the Vikings forged from the Hebrides, the Isle of Man, and the coastal territories of Ireland and Scotland, reached its apogee under the rule of Godred Crovan, a figure who strides out of the mists of the 11th century like a character from the sagas, a sea king whose ambition, ruthlessness, and strategic brilliance created a dynasty that would dominate the western seaways for nearly 2 centuries. Godred, whose name in Old Norse was Gur, meaning God's peace, was a warrior of the old school, a man who had fought at the Battle of Stamford Bridge in 1066, the apocalyptic clash that ended the Viking Age in England, and who had survived the slaughter to carve out a new kingdom on the edge of the world. His origins are obscure, wrapped in the conflicting genealogies of the later chroniclers, but he emerges into the full light of history in 1079, when he landed on the Isle of Man with a fleet of longships and a hardened army of Norse-Gaelic warriors, determined to seize the throne of the Isles from the ruling dynasty that had held it for generations. The ensuing campaign, which is recorded in the Chronicles of the Kings of Man in the Isles, a precious Latin manuscript that is the primary source for the history of the kingdom, was a masterpiece of Viking amphibious warfare, a series of lightning strikes and pitched battles that culminated in the decisive victory at the Battle of Sky Hill, where Godred shattered the forces of the incumbent king, Fingal, and claimed the crown for himself. The reign of Godred Crovan, which lasted from 1079 until his death in 1095, was the foundation of a new era for the Kingdom of the Isles, a time of consolidation, expansion, and the establishment of a stable dynasty that would rule the Hebrides and Man for the generations to come. The specific political and military achievements of Godred Crovan, which are recorded in the Chronicles of the Kings of Man and the Isles and in the later Norse and Irish sources, were the result of his exceptional abilities as a commander and a statesman, qualities that were the hallmark of the great Viking leaders of the age. Godred, who was a master of the naval warfare, understood that the power of the Kingdom of the Isles depended on the control of the sea lanes, the network of the routes that linked the islands to the markets of the Ireland, the England, and the Scandinavia. He built a formidable fleet of the longships, the Snecture and the Skyer, which were the instruments of his power, the vessels that allowed him to project his force across the Irish Sea and to strike at his enemies with the speed and the surprise that were the hallmarks of the Viking warfare. He also fortified his island strongholds, the great castles of the Peel on the Isle of Man and the Dunvegan on the Skye, which were the bases for his garrisons and the symbols of his authority. Godred's military prowess was matched by his political acumen, his ability to forge the alliances with the Irish kings, the Norse earls of Orkney, and the Scottish monarchs, a diplomatic skill that was essential for the survival of his fragile kingdom in the turbulent world of the 11th century politics. The specific administrative and the legal reforms of Godred Crovan, which were the foundation of the stable and the prosperous society of the Kingdom of the Isles, were a blend of the Norse and the Gaelic traditions, a synthesis that was the characteristic of the hybrid culture of the region. Godred, who was a Christian ruler, albeit a pragmatic and occasionally violent one, supported the Church, granting the lands and the privileges to the monasteries and the bishoprics, a policy that was the key to the integration of his kingdom into the wider Christian community of the Europe. He also established a system of the taxation and the tribute, the scat, that was collected from the subject territories, a revenue stream that funded his military campaigns and his building projects. The legal code of the Kingdom of the Isles, which was based on the Norse-Gaelic law and the Gaelic Brehon law, was a sophisticated and a flexible system, a body of the law that was administered by the Thing assemblies and the royal judges, the Brehons, who traveled the circuit of the islands to hear the disputes and to deliver the justice. The administrative and the legal foundations that were laid by Godred Crovan were the basis of the prosperity and the stability of the Kingdom of the Isles for the generations after his death. The specific succession of the rulers of the Kingdom of the Isles after the death of Godred Crovan in 1095 was a period of the dynastic conflict and the external pressure, a time that tested the resilience of the kingdom that he had built. Godred was succeeded by his son, Langman, who ruled for only a few years before he was overthrown by a rebellion, a fate that was common among the Viking rulers of the age. The throne then passed to a series of the short-lived and the contested kings, including the Olaf I, the Godred II, and the Somerled, the latter of whom was a Norse-Gaelic warlord of the Argyll who would eventually challenge the power of the Manx dynasty and establish his own lordship in the Hebrides. The dynastic conflicts of the early 12th century, which were the result of the Viking tradition of the partible inheritance and the personal ambition, were a period of the instability and the violence, a time that was the prelude to the rise of a new power in the western Seaways, the Lords of the Isles. The specific legacy of Godred Crovan and the dynasty that he founded is the enduring political and the cultural identity of the Kingdom of the Isles, a realm that was the last bastion of the independent Norse power in the British Isles and that was the bridge between the Scandinavian and the Gaelic worlds. The descendants of Godred Crovan, who ruled the Kingdom of the Isles until the late 13th century, were the sea kings who commanded the loyalty of the island lords and who were the players in the great game of the medieval politics, the allies and the enemies of the Scottish, the Norwegian, and the English monarchs. The memory of Godred Crovan, which was preserved in the chronicles of the kings of Man and the Isles and in the oral traditions of the Hebrides, is a reminder of the golden age of the Viking sea kings, a time when the longships ruled the waves and the islands were the center of a maritime empire. The Kingdom of the Isles, which was the product of the Viking expansion, was the greatest of the Norse-Gaelic achievements, a realm that was the testament to the fusion of the two cultures and the enduring legacy of the Viking Age in the Scotland. The Battle of Clontarf, which was fought on Good Friday, April 23, 1014, on the banks of the River Tolka near Dublin, was one of the most significant and the most mythologized battles of the Viking Age, a cataclysmic clash that pitted the forces of the Irish High King Brian Boru against the coalition of the Viking lords of Dublin, the Norse-Gaelic warriors of the Isles, and the rebellious Irish allies. The battle, which was the culmination of the decades of the conflict between the Irish and the Norse for the control of the rich trading port of Dublin and the surrounding territories, was a turning point in the history of the Norse presence in the Ireland and the Scotland, a moment that marked the beginning of the end of the Viking dominance of the Irish Sea. The scale and the ferocity of the Battle of Clontarf, which was recorded in the Irish annals, the Norse sagas, and the later literary works, have made it one of the most famous and the most debated events of the early medieval period, a battle that has been the subject of the endless analysis and the romanticization by the historians and the poets. The specific composition of the forces that fought at the Battle of Clontarf, which is a reflection of the complex and the interwoven nature of the Norse-Gaelic society of the 11th century, is a crucial element of the story. On the side of the Brian Boru, the High King of Ireland, were the warriors of the Munster, the Meath, and the Connaught, the Irish clans that had been united under his leadership in a rare moment of the political cohesion. On the side of the Viking alliance, which was led by the Sitric Silkbeard, the Norse king of Dublin, and his ally, the male Mortimac Merchada, the king of the Leinster, were the warriors of the Dublin Norse, the Norse-Gaelic mercenaries from the Hebrides, the Orkney, and the Isle of Man, and the contingent of the Vikings who had been hired from the far-flung corners of the Scandinavian world. The saga of the Njals Saga, the great Icelandic epic of the 13th century, describes the arrival of the Viking champions, including the formidable Earl Sigurd the Stout of Orkney, who was promised the kingship of the Ireland by the Sitric Silkbeard as the reward for his support. The presence of the Orkney Earls at the Clontarf is a testament to the interconnectedness of the Norse world, a network of the alliances and the rivalries that spanned the North Atlantic. The specific course of the Battle of Clontarf, which lasted from the dawn to the dusk, was a savage and a bloody affair, a clash of the shield walls and the melee combat that was typical of the Viking and the Irish warfare of the age. The Irish forces, which were the larger and the better organized, were able to hold their ground against the initial Viking assaults, the waves of the axes and the swords that crashed against the Irish shields. The tide of the battle turned when the Brian Boru, who was then an old man in his 70s and who was praying in his tent at the rear of the Irish lines, was discovered and killed by a group of the Viking warriors, a blow that was a devastating loss for the Irish cause. But the death of the Brian Boru, which was the moment of the greatest peril, was also the moment of the greatest resolve, and the Irish forces, led by his son Merchad and his grandson Tord Helbach, rallied and drove the Viking coalition from the field, inflicting a massive slaughter on the fleeing warriors. The Battle of Clontarf, which was a victory for the Irish, was a Pyrrhic one, a battle that had cost the lives of the High King and many of the Irish nobility, a loss that was the end of the brief unity that Brian Boru had achieved. The specific consequences of the Battle of Clontarf for the Norse in the Scotland and the Isles were profound and far-reaching, a shift in the balance of the power that would have the lasting effects on the political landscape of the region. The death of the Sigurd the Stout at the Clontarf, which is recorded in the Orkneyinga saga, was a severe blow to the earldom of Orkney, a loss that plunged the islands into a period of the dynastic conflict and the instability. The defeat of the Viking coalition at the Clontarf, which was a demonstration of the growing power of the Irish kingdoms and the limits of the Norse military capabilities, was a warning to the sea kings of the Isles, a sign that the days of the easy plunder and the unchallenged dominance were coming to an end. The Battle of Clontarf, which was the last great battle of the Viking Age in the Ireland, marked the beginning of the gradual decline of the Norse power in the Irish Sea, a decline that would eventually lead to the absorption of the Norse territories into the Gaelic and the Scottish kingdoms. The specific legacy of the Battle of Clontarf in the historical and the cultural memory of the Norse and the Irish is a subject of the enduring fascination, a battle that has been the source of the inspiration for the literature, the art, and the national mythology. The Irish annals, which are the primary sources for the battle, describe the Clontarf in the apocalyptic terms, a day of the slaughter that was the end of the pagan era and the triumph of the Christian faith. The Norse sagas, particularly the Njals Saga, present a different and a more nuanced perspective, a view of the battle that is focused on the individual heroism and the tragic fate of the Viking champions. The Battle of Clontarf, which was a real and a devastating event, has been transformed by the centuries of the storytelling into a myth, a symbol of the conflict between the old world and the new, the pagan and the Christian, the Norse and the Gael. The legacy of the Clontarf, which is still celebrated in the Irish national consciousness, is a reminder of the pivotal role that the Vikings played in the history of the Ireland and the Scotland, a role that was both destructive and creative. The rise of Somerled, the Norse-Gaelic lord of Argyll who challenged the power of the Manx dynasty and established a new political order in the Hebrides in the mid-12th century, is one of the most dramatic and the consequential stories of the Viking Age in the Scotland. Somerled, whose name in the Old Norse means summer warrior, a fitting title for a sea king who launched his campaigns in the season of the calm seas and the long days, was a figure of the extraordinary ability and the ambition, a man who was the product of the mixed Norse and Gaelic culture of the western seaboard. His origins are shrouded in the mists of the legend, but he emerges into the historical record in the 1130s as a powerful and ambitious lord, a man who had built a formidable fleet of the longships and the burlens, the traditional Gaelic galleys, and who was the master of the rugged coastline of the Argyll and the islands of the Inner Hebrides. Somerled, who was a brilliant naval commander and a charismatic leader, was the embodiment of the Norse-Gaelic ideal, a fusion of the Viking warrior and the Gaelic chieftain, a man who was equally at home on the deck of a ship or in the hall of a king. The specific conflict between Somerled and the Godred Olafsson, the king of the Isles, which erupted in the 1150s, was the result of the decades of the tension and the rivalry between the two great lords of the Hebrides, a struggle for the supremacy that was the characteristic of the Viking political culture. The immediate cause of the war was the appeal of the Norse-Gaelic chieftains of the Hebrides, who were the subjects of the Godred and who were resentful of his heavy-handed rule and his attempts to centralize the power in the Manx kingdom. The chieftains, who were led by the Thorfinnatarsson, the powerful lord of the Lewis and the Harris, invited the Somerled to intervene on their behalf, a call that he was eager to answer. The ensuing war, which was fought on the land and the sea across the Hebrides and the Isle of Man, was a classic example of the Viking and the Gaelic warfare, a conflict of the raids, the sieges, and the pitched battles that culminated in the decisive naval engagement at the Battle of the Epiphany in 1156, a battle that was fought on a stormy January night off the coast of the Isle. The battle, which was a victory for the Somerled, resulted in the partition of the Kingdom of the Isles, with the Godred retaining the Isle of Man and the islands of the north, and the Somerled claiming the lordship of the southern Hebrides, including the Isle, the Jura, the Mull, and the Kintyre. The specific political and the military achievements of Somerled after the Battle of the Epiphany were the foundation of a new and a powerful lordship in the Hebrides, a realm that was the precursor of the later lordship of the Isles, the great Gaelic Norse principality that would dominate the western Scotland for the next 3 centuries. Somerled, who was now the undisputed master of the southern Hebrides, set about the consolidation of his power, building the castles, the churches, and the monasteries, and establishing the system of the administration and the taxation that was the basis of his authority. He also sought to expand his influence into the mainland of the Scotland, a campaign that led to his invasion of the Renfrew and the Clyde in 1164, a bold but ultimately fatal gamble. Somerled, who was at the head of a large fleet and an army of the Hebridean warriors, was killed in the battle against the forces of the Scottish King Malcolm IV, a death that was the end of his remarkable career but not the end of his dynasty. The descendants of Somerled, who were known as the Clan Sumhail, the Clan Donald, the Clan Dougal, and the Clan Rary, would become the most powerful of the Highland clans, the lords of the Isles who would dominate the western Scotland for the centuries to come. The specific legacy of Somerled in the history of the Scotland is the creation of the Lordship of the Isles, a unique and enduring political entity that was the direct descendant of the Norse-Gaelic kingdom of the Godred Crovan and the Somerled. The Lordship of the Isles, which was formally recognized by the Scottish Crown in the 14th century, was a semi-autonomous principality that was ruled by the descendants of the Somerled, the MacDonalds, who were the most powerful of the Highland clans and who were the rivals and the occasional allies of the Scottish kings. The lordship, which was based on the island of the Islay and the fortress of the Finlagan, was a maritime power, a realm that was held together by the fleet of the galleys and the network of the sea routes, a world that was the direct descendant of the Viking sea kingdoms of the earlier age. The Somerled, who was the founder of this dynasty, is remembered in the Gaelic tradition as the Sumhailmore, the Great Somerled, a hero who was the liberator of the Hebrides from the tyranny of the Manx kings and who was the father of the clans of the West. The legacy of the Somerled, which is the fusion of the Norse and the Gaelic, is the enduring identity of the Highland and the Island Scotland. The Norse presence in the Caithness and the Sutherland, the rugged and the windswept territories that formed the northeastern corner of the Scottish mainland, was a crucial and an often overlooked aspect of the Viking expansion in Scotland, a presence that was the direct result of the conquests of the Earls of Orkney and that led to the creation of a Norse-speaking colony that would persist for the centuries. The Caithness, which is the land of the Cat tribe, the ancient Pictish people who had inhabited the region since the Iron Age, was the first of the mainland territories to fall under the Norse control, a process that was led by the Sigurd the Mighty, the first Earl of Orkney, in the late 9th century. The Norse conquest of the Caithness, which was accomplished by the force of the arms and the settlement of the Norse farmers and the warriors, was a violent and a transformative event, a process that displaced or absorbed the native Pictish population and that established a new, Scandinavian-speaking society on the mainland. The Sutherland, which is the southern land of the Norsemen, the territory that lies to the south and the west of the Caithness, was also the subject of the Norse colonization, a process that was less complete than in the Caithness but that left a significant and a lasting Norse imprint on the region. The specific archaeological evidence for the Norse presence in the Caithness and the Sutherland is less extensive than in the Orkney or the Shetland, a fact that is due to the more dispersed nature of the settlement and the subsequent development of the region, but the evidence that does exist is a clear indication of the scale and the impact of the Norse colonization. The pagan graves that have been found in the Caithness, including the warrior burials at the Ray and the Akergil, are the evidence of the early phase of the Norse settlement, a phase that was characterized by the retention of the traditional Norse beliefs and the practices. The silver hoards that have been discovered in the region, such as the Skyle hoard in the Orkney, which contained the coins and the bullion that were the wealth of the Norse traders and the raiders, are the evidence of the economic activity and the integration of the region into the Norse commercial networks. The place names of the Caithness and the Sutherland, which are overwhelmingly of the Norse origin, are the most visible and the most enduring testimony to the Norse colonization, a linguistic landscape that is filled with the names that end in the bster, farm, the dale, valley, the ness, headland, and the wick, bay, a map that was drawn by the Norse settlers and that is the permanent record of their presence. The specific political relationship between the Earls of Orkney and the Scottish kings over the control of the Caithness and the Sutherland was a long and a complex saga of the conflict, the negotiation, and the dynastic marriage, a struggle that was the central theme of the Norse-Scottish relations for the centuries. The Earldom of Orkney, which was the sovereign entity under the suzerainty of the Norwegian crown, claimed the Caithness as a part of its territory, a claim that was based on the conquest of the Sigurd the Mighty and that was maintained by the subsequent earls. The Scottish kings, who were the rulers of the mainland, also claimed the Caithness as a part of their kingdom, a claim that was based on the ancient Pictish and the Gaelic territories and that was pressed by the military and the diplomatic means. The conflict between the earls and the kings, which was often violent, and which involved the shifting alliances and the betrayals, was a constant feature of the medieval history of the north of the Scotland. The resolution of the conflict, which was achieved by the marriage of the Scottish princesses to the Norse earls and by the gradual recognition of the Scottish sovereignty over the region, was a process that took the centuries and that was the foundation of the modern political map of the Scotland. The specific linguistic and the cultural legacy of the Norse in the Caithness and the Sutherland is a rich and a fascinating subject, a legacy that is the reflection of the centuries of the Norse presence and the subsequent integration into the Scottish kingdom. The dialect of the Scots that is spoken in the Caithness, which is known as the Caithness Scots or the Caitins, contains a significant number of the words of the Norse origin, a lexical legacy that is the living link to the Viking past. The words for the everyday objects, the natural features, and the agricultural practices, such as the brog, bridge, the fell, hill, the gill, ravine, and the troll, are the remnants of the Norn language that was once spoken across the region. The cultural traditions of the Caithness and the Sutherland, which include the festivals, the music, and the folklore, are also the product of the Norse heritage, a heritage that is celebrated by the local communities and that is the source of the regional identity. The Norse legacy in the Caithness and the Sutherland, which is the legacy of the centuries of the settlement and the integration, is a permanent part of the Scottish cultural mosaic. The Orkneyinga saga, the saga of the Earls of Orkney, is one of the most precious and the most fascinating literary treasures of the medieval Norse world, a work of the history, the biography, and the storytelling that is the primary source for the history of the Norse and the Scotland, and that is a window into the minds and the lives of the Viking earls. The saga, which was written in the Iceland in the late 12th or the early 13th century by an unknown author who was likely a scholar and a poet with the close ties to the Orkney, is a compilation of the oral traditions, the earlier written sources, and the poetic verses that had been passed down through the generations of the Norse settlers. The saga, which is a blend of the historical fact and the literary embellishment, tells the story of the Earls of Orkney from the legendary origins in the 9th century to the early 13th century, a narrative that is filled with the battles, the feuds, the alliances, the betrayals, the murders, and the moments of the heroism and the tragedy that were the stuff of the Viking political life. The Orkney saga, which is a masterpiece of the Old Norse prose, is a unique and invaluable resource, a chronicle that brings the world of the Viking sea kings to the vivid and the dramatic life. The specific historical value of the Orkney saga is a subject that has been debated by the historians and the literary scholars for the generations, a debate that reflects the complex nature of the saga as a source. The saga, which was written over 2 centuries after the events that it describes, is not a reliable record of the early history of the Orkney in the modern sense of the term. The chronology is often confused, the events are compressed or expanded, the characters are idealized or demonized, and the supernatural elements, such as the prophecies, the curses, and the magic, are woven into the narrative. But the saga, despite its limitations, contains a vast amount of the valuable information that is confirmed by the other sources, the Irish annals, the Scottish chronicles, and the archaeological evidence. The saga provides the details of the lives of the earls, the battles they fought, the lands they ruled, the churches they built, and the laws they made, a wealth of the information that is not available from any other source. The Orkney saga, which is the product of the oral tradition that was the memory of the Norse community in the Orkney, is a reflection of the way that the Norse themselves remembered and understood their own history, a history that was the foundation of their identity and their culture. The specific characters that populate the Orkney saga are a gallery of the vivid and the unforgettable figures, the heroes and the villains, the saints and the sinners, who embody the values and the contradictions of the Viking Age. The Sigurd the Mighty, the first Earl, is the archetypal Viking warrior, a man of the immense strength and the courage who dies a bizarre and a gruesome death, a victim of his own pride and the trophy-taking. The Thorfinn the Mighty, the greatest of the Earls, is a complex and a multifaceted character, a ruler who is both a ruthless conqueror and a pious Christian, a man who makes the pilgrimage to the Rome and who builds the churches, but who also wages the relentless wars against his rivals and who dies in his bed, a rare fate for a Viking earl. The Magnus Erlendsson, the saintly earl who was martyred by his cousin, the Hakon, in the 1115, is the Christ-like figure of the saga, a man of the peace and the piety who is the victim of the political intrigue and the violence that was the curse of the Viking politics. The Ragnvald Kalli Kolsson, the poet earl who built the Cathedral of St. Magnus in the Kirkwall, is the epitome of the 12th century Renaissance man, a warrior, a poet, a builder, and a pilgrim who is the embodiment of the fusion of the Norse and the Christian cultures. The specific literary qualities of the Orkney saga, which are the source of its enduring appeal and its artistic merit, are a blend of the realistic detail, the dramatic narrative, and the poetic sensibility that are the hallmarks of the great sagas of the Icelanders. The saga, which is written in a spare and a understated prose, is a masterpiece of the storytelling, a work that moves with a swift and a compelling pace from the one episode to the next, carrying the reader on a journey through the centuries of the violence, the ambition, and the fate. The poetic verses that are interspersed throughout the saga, which are the compositions of the earls and the poets themselves, are the jewels of the narrative, the moments of the reflection and the emotion that capture the essence of the Viking spirit. The Orkney saga, which is a work of the literature as well as the history, is the immortal voice of the Norse and the Scotland, a voice that still speaks to us across the centuries, a voice that tells the story of the Sea Kings and their world. The specific transition from the Norse paganism to the Christianity in the Scotland, which we have already touched upon, deserves a more detailed and a nuanced examination, for it was a process that unfolded over the several centuries, and that was the result of the complex interplay of the personal conversions, the political calculations, the missionary activity, and the gradual transformation of the Norse culture. The pagan religion of the Vikings, which was a rich and a complex system of the beliefs and the practices that was centered on the worship of the gods and the goddesses, Odin, the All-Father, the god of the wisdom, the war, and the poetry, Thor, the thunderer, the protector of the humans and the slayer of the giants, Freya, the goddess of the love, the fertility, and the magic, and the many other deities who inhabited the Norse cosmos, was a faith that was deeply embedded in the culture and the identity of the Norse people. The conversion, which required the abandonment of the old gods and the acceptance of the new, was a traumatic and a difficult process, a process that was resisted by many and that was accomplished only gradually. The specific evidence for the survival of the pagan practices in the Norse Scotland, even after the formal conversion of the rulers, is a fascinating and often overlooked aspect of the religious history of the region. The archaeological record, which includes the pagan graves, the amulets, and the cult objects that have been found in the Norse settlements, suggests that the old beliefs persisted for the generations after the official conversion, a phenomenon that is known from the other parts of the Viking world. The Thor's hammer pendants, which were worn as the symbols of the allegiance to the old god, have been found in the graves and the settlements of the Norse Scotland, a sign that the worship of the Thor continued to be practiced by the ordinary people long after the earls and the kings had embraced the Christianity. The runic inscriptions that invoke the pagan gods, such as the Thor's hammer runes that have been found at the Maeshowe in the Orkney, are another indication of the persistence of the old faith, a faith that was not easily abandoned by the people who had grown up with the stories of the gods and the heroes. The specific role of the native Christian communities in the conversion of the Norse settlers was a crucial and often underappreciated factor, a factor that was the result of the close contact and the intermarriage between the Norse and the native populations. The native women, who were often the wives of the Norse warriors and the settlers, were the primary agents of the conversion, the mothers who raised their children in the Christian faith and who brought the influence of the church into the Norse households. The native clergy, who were the survivors of the Viking raids and who continued to minister to the Christian communities in the Norse settled areas, were the other agents of the conversion, the men who preached the gospel to the pagan settlers and who administered the sacraments to the converts. The conversion, which was a gradual and a bottom-up process, was the result of the daily interaction and the mutual influence of the Norse and the native communities, a process that was the reflection of the cultural fusion that was the characteristic of the Norse-Gaelic society. The specific impact of the conversion on the political and the social structure of the Norse Scotland was a profound and a lasting one, a transformation that was the foundation of the integration of the Norse territories into the wider Christian community of the Europe. The conversion of the earls and the kings, which was often the result of the political alliances and the military pressure, was the crucial step in the process, a step that opened the door for the establishment of the church institutions, the bishoprics, the monasteries, and the parishes, which were the backbone of the Christian society. The bishopric of the Orkney, which was established in the early 11th century by the Earl Thorfinn the Mighty, was the first of the permanent church institutions in the Norse Scotland, a foundation that was the center of the Christian life and the learning in the islands for the centuries to come. The conversion, which was the end of the pagan age, was the beginning of a new era for the Norse and the Scotland, an era of the integration and the participation in the cultural and the spiritual life of the Christendom. The specific legacy of the conversion is the rich and the distinctive Christian culture of the Northern and the Western Isles, a culture that is the product of the fusion of the Norse and the Gaelic traditions, and that is expressed in the art, the architecture, and the literature of the region. The Romanesque and the Gothic churches that were built by the Norse earls and the lords, such as the Cathedral of St. Magnus in the Kirkwall and the Church of St. Clement at the Rodel in the Harris, are the masterpieces of the medieval architecture, a fusion of the Scandinavian and the European styles that is the visual expression of the Christian faith and the Norse heritage. The illuminated manuscripts, the carved stone crosses, and the metalwork that were produced in the Norse Scotland are the treasures of the medieval art, a body of the work that is the testimony to the skill and the devotion of the Norse-Gaelic craftsmen. The conversion, which was the transformation of the Viking spirit, was the source of a new and a vibrant Christian culture, a culture that is the enduring legacy of the Viking Age in the Scotland. The specific architectural and the artistic legacy of the Norse in the Scotland is a treasure of the immense value and the beauty, a body of the work that includes the stone churches, the carved crosses, the runic inscriptions, and the metalwork that are the physical remains of the Viking presence and the Norse-Gaelic culture. The Norse settlers, who were the builders and the craftsmen of the great skill, left behind a remarkable architectural heritage. The Romanesque and the Gothic churches that dot the landscape of the northern and the western Isles, the buildings that are the symbols of the Christian faith and the Norse power. The Cathedral of St. Magnus in the Kirkwall, which was begun in 1137 by the Earl Ragnvald Calle Colson in honor of his martyred uncle, is the most magnificent of the Norse churches in the Scotland, a masterpiece of the Romanesque architecture that is built of the red and the yellow sandstone, with the massive pillars, the rounded arches, and the elaborate carvings that are the glory of the medieval Orkney. The cathedral, which is the northernmost of the great medieval cathedrals of the Britain, is the spiritual heart of the Orkney, and the enduring monument to the Norse earls who built it. The specific smaller churches and the chapels that were built by the Norse settlers across the northern and the western Isles, which are often overlooked by the visitors who are drawn to the great cathedrals, are the equally important and the equally beautiful examples of the Norse-Gaelic architecture. The Church of St. Clement at the Rodel, on the Isle of Harris, which was built in the early 16th century on the site of an earlier Norse church, is a stunning example of the late Gothic architecture, a building that is adorned with the intricate carvings of the foliage, the animals, and the biblical scenes, including the famous Sheila na Gig, the mysterious female fertility figure that is found on the many of the medieval churches in the Ireland and the Scotland. The round church of the Orfeer in the Orkney, which was built in the late 11th or the early 12th century, is a rare example of the circular church, a design that was modeled on the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in the Jerusalem, and that was the distinctive feature of the Norse and the Templar architecture. The small chapels and the churches that are scattered across the Hebrides, the Shetland, and the Orkney, which are often in the ruinous state, are the reminders of the piety and the craftsmanship of the Norse-Gaelic people. The specific carved stone crosses and the cross slabs that are the most distinctive and the most beautiful of the Norse-Gaelic artistic achievements, a fusion of the Scandinavian and the Celtic styles that is the visual expression of the cultural fusion of the Viking Age. The Kildalton cross on the Isle of the Islay, which dates from the late 8th or the early 9th century, is one of the finest examples of the high cross tradition, a massive, freestanding cross that is carved with the biblical scenes, the interlaced patterns, and the animal motifs, a masterpiece of the early medieval art that is the product of the Iona school of the sculpture. The cross slabs that are found on the many of the Hebridean islands, such as the Pabe, the Barra, and the North Uist, are the smaller and the more numerous examples of the same tradition. The stones that are carved with the crosses, the runic inscriptions, and the scenes from the Norse mythology, a fusion of the Christian and the pagan that is the hallmark of the Norse-Gaelic art. The runic inscriptions that are carved on the stones and the artifacts across the Norse Scotland, including the famous Maeshowe runes, which were carved by the Norse visitors to the ancient chamber tomb in the 12th century, are the direct voice of the Viking Age, a voice that speaks of the everyday concerns, the boasts, the jokes, and the prayers of the Norsemen. The specific metalwork and the jewelry that were produced by the Norse and the Norse-Gaelic craftsmen, which have been recovered from the graves, the hoards, and the settlements, are the exquisite and the personal artifacts that provide a glimpse into the lives and the tastes of the Viking settlers. The silver brooches, the arm rings, the pendants, and the other ornaments that have been found in the Norse sites, such as the Great Hoard from the Skull in the Orkney, are the examples of the high level of the skill and the artistry of the Norse metalworkers, the craftsmen who were influenced by the styles of the Scandinavia, the Ireland, and the Anglo-Saxon England. The weapons, the tools, and the everyday objects that have been recovered, which are often decorated with the intricate patterns and the runic inscriptions, are the evidence of the integration of the art and the craft into the daily life of the Norse community. The artistic legacy of the Norse in the Scotland, which is the product of the centuries of the cultural fusion, is a treasure that is the permanent and the beautiful testament to the creativity and the spirit of the Viking Age. The specific influence of the Norse law and the governance on the development of the Scottish legal and the political institutions is a legacy that is often underappreciated, but that is fundamental to the understanding of the distinctive character of the Scottish society and the state. The Norse settlers, who brought with them a sophisticated and a well-developed system of the law and the governance, had a profound impact on the regions that they colonized, an impact that can be traced through the centuries and that is visible in the legal traditions, the administrative structures, and the political culture of the Northern and the Western Isles, and to a lesser extent, of the Scotland as a whole. The Norse legal system, which was based on the principles of the personal freedom, the communal responsibility, and the rule of the law, was a radical departure from the feudal and the hierarchical norms of the medieval Europe, a system that was the product of the unique social and the political conditions of the Viking world. The specific institution of the Thing, the local assembly of the free men that was the cornerstone of the Norse political and the legal system, was a crucial and a lasting contribution to the governance of the Scottish Islands. The Thing, which was known by the various names in the different regions, the Ting in the Shetland, the Tingwall in the Orkney, the Tainal in the Hebrides, was a gathering of the free men of the district, who met at the regular intervals to discuss the matters of the common interest, to resolve the disputes, to make the laws, and to judge the offenders. The Thing was presided over by the Lgskummer, the law speaker, a man who was the repository of the oral law and who was responsible for the reciting of the legal code from the memory, a task that required the immense learning and the authority. The Thing, which was the expression of the Norse concept of the self-government and the rule of the law, was a unique and a precious institution, a model that has been compared to the early parliaments and the assemblies of the later democratic tradition. The legacy of the Thing can still be seen in the place names, such as the Tingwall in the Shetland and the Dingwall in the Ross and Cromarty, and in the traditions of the local governance that have persisted in the Scottish Islands. The specific concept of the Udal law, the system of the allodial land tenure that was the distinctive feature of the Norse legal tradition in the Scotland, was a crucial and an enduring contribution to the property law of the region. The Udal law, which was the system of the absolute and the perpetual ownership of the land by the individual, or the family, without any superior lord or any feudal obligation, was a radical departure from the feudal system that was the norm in the medieval Europe, a system that was based on the hierarchy of the lords and the vassals and the principle of the service in return for the land. The Udal law, which was the product of the Viking society that was based on the independent and the self-sufficient free farmers, was the foundation of the economic and the social independence of the Norse settlers in the Scotland. The Udal law, which was recognized by the Scottish Crown after the annexation of the Norse territories, survived for the centuries, and its principles are still reflected in the modern Scottish property law, particularly in the Shetland and the Orkney, where the Udal titles are still the subject of the legal recognition and the dispute. The specific influence of the Norse legal and the political traditions on the development of the Scottish Parliament and the broader constitutional tradition is a subject that has been debated by the historians, but that is supported by a considerable body of the evidence. The Scottish Parliament, which emerged in the 13th century as the assembly of the nobles, the clergy, and the burgesses, was a product of the feudal and the European influences, but it also incorporated elements of the older, Celtic and Norse traditions of the assembly and the consultation. The Thing assemblies of the Norse territories, which were the local expressions of the principle of the self-government, were the precursors of the later institutions of the local governance, such as the sheriff courts and the burgh councils, which were the foundation of the Scottish local administration. The Norse legal traditions, which emphasized the rule of the law and the rights of the free men, contributed to the development of the Scottish legal and the constitutional thought, a thought that would find its fullest expression in the Declaration of Arbroath and the later struggles for the liberty and the self-determination. The specific legacy of the Norse law and the governance is the distinctive legal and the political culture of the Scotland, a culture that is the product of the fusion of the Celtic, the Norse, the Anglo-Norman, and the Roman influences, a culture that is characterized by the emphasis on the rule of the law, the rights of the individual, and the principle of the accountability of the government. The Scottish legal system, which is a unique blend of the Roman law, the feudal law, and the customary law, has been influenced by the Norse legal traditions, a legacy that is the testament to the enduring impact of the Viking settlement. The Scottish tradition of the local governance, which is based on the principle of the community participation and the local accountability, is the direct descendant of the Thing assemblies of the Viking Age. The Norse law and the governance, which were brought to the Scotland by the Viking settlers, are the invisible foundation of the modern Scottish democracy, a foundation that is the true and the lasting treasure of the Viking Age. The specific genetic legacy of the Norse in the Scotland, which we have already mentioned in the context of the Orkney and the Shetland, is a subject that has been the focus of the intense scientific investigation in the recent decades, an investigation that has been made possible by the advances in the DNA analysis and the population genetics. And that has provided a new and a powerful tool for the understanding of the scale and the nature of the Viking settlement. The genetic studies, which have been conducted by the researchers at the University of Edinburgh, the University of Leicester, and the other institutions, have analyzed the DNA of the modern populations of the Scotland, the Northern Isles, the Hebrides, and the other regions that were affected by the Norse colonization, comparing the genetic profiles to the reference populations in the Scandinavia, the Ireland, the England, and the other parts of the Europe. The results of these studies, which have been published in the leading scientific journals, have confirmed and quantified the Norse genetic contribution to the Scottish gene pool, a contribution that varies significantly from the region to region, reflecting the different patterns of the settlement and the integration. The specific Y chromosome evidence, which is the genetic marker that is passed down from the father to the son along the direct paternal line, has been particularly valuable for the tracing of the Norse migration, as the Y chromosome can provide a clear and unambiguous signal of the paternal ancestry. The studies have shown that the modern populations of the Orkney and the Shetland have a very high proportion of the Y chromosome markers that are characteristic of the Scandinavian populations, a proportion that is much higher than in the rest of the Scotland or the British Isles. This finding is consistent with the historical and the archaeological evidence that suggests a massive and a comprehensive Norse settlement in the Northern Isles, a settlement that involved the replacement or the subjugation of the native male population by the Norse warriors and the settlers. The Y chromosome evidence from the Hebrides and the other parts of the western Scotland also shows a significant, but a less pronounced, Norse influence, a pattern that is consistent with the historical accounts of the Norse settlement and the subsequent cultural fusion with the native Gaelic populations. The specific mitochondrial DNA evidence, which is the genetic marker that is passed down from the mother to the children along the direct maternal line, tells a different and a more complex story, a story that is the reflection of the role of the native women in the process of the Norse settlement. The studies have shown that the mitochondrial DNA of the modern populations of the Northern and the Western Isles is predominantly of the native, pre-Norse origin, a finding that suggests that the Norse settlers, who were predominantly the men, took the native women as their wives and that the maternal line of the modern islanders is largely the indigenous. This pattern, which is known from the other parts of the Viking world, such as the Iceland and the Greenland, is a testament to the intermarriage and the cultural fusion that were the foundation of the Norse-Gaelic society. The genetic legacy of the Norse in the Scotland, which is the combination of the Norse paternal and the native maternal ancestry, is a biological record of the meeting and the blending of the two peoples, a record that is written in the blood of the modern Scots. The specific implications of the genetic studies for the understanding of the Viking settlement of the Scotland are the subject of the ongoing research and the debate, a debate that is the reflection of the complexities of the historical process and the limitations of the genetic data. The genetic evidence, which is a powerful and a valuable tool, cannot provide the precise dates or the detailed narratives of the past, and it must be interpreted in the context of the historical, the archaeological, and the linguistic evidence. The genetic studies have confirmed the broad outlines of the Norse settlement, the massive impact on the Northern Isles, the significant but the varied impact on the Hebrides and the western mainland, and the limited impact on the rest of the Scotland. But the details of the story, the specific origins of the settlers, the timing of the migrations, the patterns of the intermarriage, and the social dynamics of the settlement, are still the subjects of the active investigation. The genetic legacy of the Norse, which is the permanent and the evolving record of the Viking Age, is a treasure that is still being discovered and understood. The specific linguistic legacy of the Norse in Scotland is one of the most visible and the most enduring of the Viking contributions to the Scottish culture, a legacy that is written in the place names, the dialects, and the vocabulary of the Northern and the Western Isles, and that is the living testimony to the centuries of the Norse presence and the cultural fusion. The Norn language, the direct descendant of the Old Norse that was spoken in the Orkney, the Shetland, and the parts of the Caithness and the Sutherland, was the everyday speech of the Norse settlers and their descendants for over 800 years, a language that evolved in the isolation of the islands and that developed its own distinctive characteristics. The Norn, which was finally extinguished as a spoken language in the late 18th or the early 19th century, was the last surviving remnant of the Old Norse in the British Isles, a language that was the direct link to the Viking Age and that was the repository of the Norse culture and the identity. The specific characteristics of the Norn language, which are known from the fragmentary records, the word lists, the rhymes, and the songs that were collected by the linguists and the antiquarians in the 18th and the 19th centuries, are a fascinating and a valuable glimpse into the linguistic world of the Norse Scotland. The Norn, which was closely related to the Faroese and the Icelandic, was a North Germanic language that had undergone a series of the changes that were the result of the isolation and the contact with the Scots and the Gaelic. The Norn vocabulary, which was the core of the language, was overwhelmingly of the Norse origin, with the words for the everyday objects, the natural features, the agricultural practices, and the social relations that were the inheritance of the Viking settlers. The Norn grammar, which was simplified and eroded over the centuries, retained the essential features of the Old Norse, the three genders, the four cases of the nouns, and the complex system of the verb conjugations. The Norn, which was the language of the sagas and the poetry that were composed in the islands, was a rich and expressive tongue, a language that was the voice of the Norse-Gaelic culture. The specific influence of the Norse on the Gaelic and the Scots languages is a legacy that is often overlooked, but that is a crucial part of the linguistic history of Scotland. The Gaelic language, which is the Celtic language that was spoken by the native populations of the Hebrides and the Western Highlands, absorbed a significant number of the Norse loanwords, particularly in the vocabulary of the seafaring, the fishing, the agriculture, and the administration, a linguistic fusion that is the reflection of the cultural fusion of the Viking Age. The Gaelic words for the scare, skerry, the bog, bay, the Eilean, island, the rubba, headland, the bada, boat, the scarb, cormorant, and the many others are the Norse borrowings that have been fully integrated into the Gaelic, a testament to the deep and the lasting impact of the Norse settlement. The Scots language, which is the Germanic language that was spoken in the lowlands and the Caithness, also contains a significant number of the Norse loanwords, the words that were brought by the Viking settlers and that were absorbed into the developing Scots tongue. The Norse loanwords in the Scots, such as the bairn, child, the gate, road, the kirk, church, and the loch, lake, are the everyday words that are the evidence of the Norse influence on the Scottish speech. The specific place names of the Scotland, which are the most widespread and the most enduring of the Norse linguistic legacies, are a map of the Viking settlement, a map that was drawn by the Norse settlers and that is the permanent record of their presence. The place names that end in the by, farm, the wick, bay, the dale, valley, the ness, headland, the bster, farmstead, the a, river, the firth, fjord, and the many other Norse elements are the signatures of the Viking colonization, a linguistic landscape that covers the northern and the western Isles, the Caithness, the Sutherland, and the other regions that were affected by the Norse expansion. The place names, which are the voice of the past, are the constant reminder of the Viking presence, a presence that is woven into the very fabric of the Scottish landscape and the Scottish identity. The linguistic legacy of the Norse, which is the language of the earth and the sea, is the true and the lasting treasure of the Viking Age in Scotland. The specific maritime legacy of the Norse in Scotland is a subject that is of the fundamental importance for the understanding of the Viking Age and the subsequent development of the Scottish seafaring tradition, a legacy that is the direct result of the Norse mastery of the sea and the adaptations of the Norse shipbuilding and the navigation to the conditions of the Scottish waters. The Viking longships, which were the revolutionary technology that enabled the Norse expansion across the North Atlantic, were the ancestors of the later Scottish vessels, the Berlins, the galleys, and the other craft that were the backbone of the maritime trade and the warfare in the highlands and the islands for the centuries. The Norse shipbuilding tradition, which was based on the clinker construction and the use of the overlapping planks, was the foundation of the Scottish boat building, a tradition that survived in the remote communities of the Hebrides and the Shetland into the modern era and that is still practiced by the traditional boat builders today. The specific design and the construction of the Scottish Berlin, the clinker-built galley that was the principal vessel of the Lords of the Isles and the Highland clans, is a direct descendant of the Viking longships, a vessel that was adapted to the conditions of the western seaways and that was the instrument of the power and the mobility of the sea kings. The Berlin, which was a shallow draft, oared vessel with a single mast and a square sail, was a versatile and a seaworthy craft, capable of navigating the narrow sea locks and the treacherous tidal races of the Hebrides, and of carrying the warriors and the supplies on the raids and the trading voyages that were the lifeblood of the Norse-Gaelic economy. The Berlin, which was often decorated with the carvings of the animals and the symbols that were the heritage of the Viking art, was a beautiful and a formidable vessel, a symbol of the power and the prestige of the clan chiefs who owned them. The maritime legacy of the Norse, which was the foundation of the Scottish seafaring tradition, is the invisible thread that connects the longships of the Viking Age to the fishing boats and the ferries of the modern Hebrides. The specific fishing and the whaling traditions of the Northern and the Western Isles, which were the core of the local economies for the centuries, are also the legacy of the Norse settlers, who brought with them the knowledge of the deep-sea fishing and the hunting of the marine mammals, a knowledge that was the product of the centuries of the experience in the cold and the rich waters of the North Atlantic. The Norse settlers, who were the skilled fishermen and the whalers, developed the techniques and the equipment that were adapted to the local conditions, the lines, the nets, the traps, and the boats that were the tools of the trade. The traditional fishing villages of the Shetland, the Orkney, and the Hebrides, with their distinctive architecture, their customs, and their dialects, are the living descendants of the Norse fishing communities, the places where the heritage of the Viking Age is still a part of the daily life. The maritime legacy of the Norse, which is the knowledge of the sea and the skill of the boat, is the foundation of the coastal culture of the Scotland, a culture that is the direct descendant of the Viking settlers. The specific trade routes and the commercial networks that the Norse established in the Scotland, which we have already discussed, were the arteries of the maritime economy, the routes that connected the remote islands to the markets of the Europe and the Scandinavia, and that brought the wealth and the goods that were the engine of the Norse-Gaelic prosperity. The legacy of these trade routes, which were the foundation of the later Scottish trade, is the enduring pattern of the maritime commerce in the region, a pattern that was the basis of the Hanseatic trade of the later medieval period and the colonial trade of the early modern era. The ports and the harbors that were the nodes of the Norse trade, such as the Lerwick, the Kirkwall, and the Stornoway, are still the centers of the maritime activity, the places where the fish, the oil, the wool, and the other products of the islands are shipped to the world. The maritime legacy of the Norse, which is the global network of the trade and the communication, is the foundation of the modern Scottish economy, a foundation that was laid by the Viking sea kings over 1,000 years ago. The specific representation of the Norse in the Scottish imagination, from the medieval chronicles to the modern films and the television series, is a subject that is of the immense cultural and the historical interest, a subject that reveals the changing attitudes to the Viking past and the ways in which the Norse heritage has been used to construct the Scottish identity. The Vikings, who were the enemies and the destroyers in the earliest sources, the annals and the chronicles that were written by the monks and the clergy who were the victims of the raids, were gradually transformed into the heroes and the ancestors, a transformation that was the result of the cultural fusion of the Norse-Gaelic period and the later Romantic movement of the 19th century. The Norse in the Scottish imagination, who were once the feared and the hated strangers, are now the celebrated and the beloved forefathers, a shift that is a testament to the power of the myth and the history to shape the identity of a nation. The specific medieval sources, such as the Irish Annals and the Chronicles of the Kings of Man and the Isles, which we have already discussed, portray the Vikings in the terms of the horror and the destruction, the Gentiles, and the pagans, who were the instruments of the divine wrath, a perspective that was the natural response of the Christian communities who were the targets of the raids. The Orkney saga, which was written from the Norse perspective, presents a very different picture, a narrative that celebrates the heroism, the ambition, and the achievement of the Earls, a story that is the foundation of the Norse identity in the Scotland. The later Scottish chronicles, such as the Scotichronicon of the Walter Bower, which was written in the 15th century, incorporate the Norse into the national story, a narrative that recognizes the contribution of the Norse to the Scottish nation and that integrates the Norse earls and the sea kings into the history of the kingdom. The specific Romantic revival of the interest in the Norse in the 19th century, which was a part of the broader European fascination with the Vikings and the medieval past, had a profound impact on the Scottish imagination, an impact that is still felt today. The novels of the Sir Walter Scott, particularly The Pirate, 1821, which is set in the Shetland and which is filled with the Norse lore and the local color, were a major factor in the popularization of the Viking myth, a myth that was the source of the inspiration for the artists, the writers, and the composers of the Romantic era. The Victorian translations of the sagas, the Orkney saga and the Heimskringla, which were published by the scholars such as the Samuel Lang and the William Morris, brought the world of the Norse to a wider audience, a world that was seen as the epitome of the heroism, the freedom, and the adventure. The romantic image of the Viking, which was the creation of the 19th century imagination, is the dominant image in the popular culture today, an image that is the blend of the historical fact and the romantic fiction. The specific modern representations of the Norse in the Scottish culture, which include the films, the television series, the video games, and the other media, are the continuation and the evolution of the Romantic tradition, a tradition that has been adapted to the tastes and the technologies of the 21st century. The Uphelly festival in the Lerwick, which we have already mentioned, is the most spectacular and the most famous of the modern Norse celebrations, a fire festival that is the living expression of the Shetlandic identity and the Norse heritage. The television series such as Vikings, which was created by the Michael Hurst and which aired from the 2013 to the 2020, has brought the story of the Norse to a global audience, a story that includes the portrayal of the Viking raids on the Scotland and the settlement of the islands. The video games such as the Assassin's Creed Valhalla, which is set in the Viking Age and which includes the locations in the Scotland, have immersed the players in the world of the Norse, a world that is the source of the endless fascination and the entertainment. The Norse in the Scottish imagination, who were once the enemy, are now the hero, a transformation that is the ultimate legacy of the Viking Age. The specific impact of the Norse settlement on the development of the Scottish national identity and the wars of the independence is a subject that is of the profound importance, a subject that reveals the ways in which the legacy of the Viking Age was woven into the fabric of the Scottish nation and the struggle for the freedom. The Norse-Gaelic culture of the Highlands and the Islands, which was the product of the fusion of the Norse and the Gaelic traditions, was a crucial component of the Scottish identity, an identity that was defined by the diversity and the hybridity, the blend of the Pictish, the Gaelic, the Norse, the Anglo-Norman, and the other influences that had shaped the Scottish people. The Norse heritage, which was the heritage of the sea kings and the island lords, contributed to the martial spirit, the independence, and the resilience that were the hallmarks of the Scottish character, the qualities that were the essential in the long and the bloody struggle against the English domination. The specific role of the Norse-descended clans, such as the MacDonalds, the MacLeods, the MacDougals, and the other families of the Hebrides and the Highlands, in the wars of the independence, which were fought from the late 13th to the mid-14th centuries, was a crucial and often overlooked factor, a factor that was the result of the military power and the strategic importance of the Norse-Gaelic lords. The lords of the Isles, who were the descendants of the Somerled and the Godred Crovan, were the most powerful of the Highland magnates, the rulers of a maritime empire that stretched from the Hebrides to the Antrim, and their support was the essential for any king who sought to rule the Scotland. Robert the Bruce, who was the hero of the wars of the independence and the victor of the Bannockburn, was the descendant of the Norse-Gaelic nobility through his mother, and he drew the crucial support from the clans of the West, a support that was the decisive factor in his campaigns against the English and their Scottish allies. The Norse-Gaelic warriors, who fought under the banner of the Bruce, were the embodiment of the fusion of the Viking and the Gaelic fighting traditions, a tradition that was the foundation of the Scottish victory at the Bannockburn. The specific declaration of Arbroath, which was the letter that was sent by the Scottish nobles to the Pope in 1320, and which is one of the most famous and the most eloquent statements of the national sovereignty and the right of the people to the self-determination, is a document that reflects the influence of the Norse political and the legal traditions, an influence that is often overlooked. The Declaration, which was drafted by the Bernard of Linton, the abbot of the Arbroath, and which was sealed by the 8 earls and the 31 barons, including the representatives of the Norse-descended families such as the Sinclairs and the Frasers, asserts the ancient independence of the Scottish kingdom and the right of the Scottish people to choose their own king. A principle that is rooted in the Norse concept of the thing, and the right of the free men to the self-government. The language of the Declaration, with its emphasis on the liberty, the loyalty, and the resistance to the tyranny, echoes the values of the Norse and the chivalric traditions, a fusion that is the characteristic of the Scottish identity. The specific legacy of the Norse and the Scottish national identity is the enduring sense of the difference, and the independence that has defined the Scottish nation for the centuries, a sense that is the product of the long and the complex history of the cultural fusion and the resistance to the external domination. The Norse heritage, which is the heritage of the sea kings and the island lords, is the source of the Scottish pride in the maritime and the military prowess, a pride that is the reflection of the Viking ancestors who sailed the longships and who conquered the lands. The Norse heritage, which is the heritage of the thing and the Udal law, is the source of the Scottish commitment to the rule of the law and the rights of the individual, a commitment that is the foundation of the modern Scottish democracy. The Norse and the Scottish national identity, who were once the strangers and the enemies, are now the ancestors and the heroes, a transformation that is the ultimate legacy of the Viking Age. The specific modern revival of the Viking heritage in Scotland, which has been a phenomenon of the recent decades, is a multifaceted and a dynamic movement that includes the academic research, the cultural festivals, the heritage tourism, the genetic genealogy, and the popular media. A movement that is the reflection of the growing interest in the Norse past and the desire to reclaim and to celebrate the Viking legacy. The Shetland and the Orkney, which were the heartlands of the Norse settlement, are the epicenters of this revival, the places where the Norse heritage is the most visible and the most passionately embraced, a part of the identity that is the source of the pride and the distinction for the islanders. The Upphellier, which we have already mentioned, is the crown jewel of the Norse revival, a festival that has grown from a local celebration into a global phenomenon, a spectacular and a dramatic event that attracts the tens of thousands of the visitors from around the world, all of whom come to witness the burning of the longship and the celebration of the Viking spirit. The specific heritage tourism that has developed around the Norse sites in Scotland is a major industry, a source of the income and the employment for the remote communities, and a means of the preserving and the interpreting the archaeological and the historical remains of the Viking Age. The Jarlshof in the Shetland, the Brough of the Bursey in the Orkney, the Udal on the North Uist, and the many other sites that are the legacy of the Norse settlement are the destinations for the visitors who are eager to walk in the footsteps of the Vikings, to see the remains of the longhouses, the graves, and the artifacts that are the physical evidence of the past. The museums, such as the Shetland Museum and the archives in the Lerwick, the Orkney Museum in the Kirkwall, and the Museum Nanilian in the Stornoway, house the collections of the Norse artifacts, the silver hoards, the runic stones, and the everyday objects that tell the story of the Viking settlers. The heritage tourism, which is the modern form of the pilgrimage, is the way in which the Norse legacy is being preserved and transmitted to the future generations. The specific academic research that has been conducted in the recent decades, which we have already discussed in the context of the genetics, the archaeology, and the linguistics, has transformed the understanding of the Norse in the Scotland, a transformation that is the result of the application of the modern scientific methods and the interdisciplinary approaches. The excavations at the sites such as the Bornish on the South Uist, the Coigru on the Westray, and the Sil Feder on the South Uist, which have been conducted by the teams from the University of the Cardiff, the University of the Glasgow, and the other institutions, have provided the new and the detailed evidence for the Norse settlement and the daily life. Evidence that is the basis of the new interpretations and the new understandings. The genetic studies, which have been the focus of the much public attention, have opened up a new frontier of the research, A frontier that is the exploration of the biological legacy of the Vikings and the personal connection of the modern Scots to their Norse ancestors. The specific modern cultural expressions of the Norse heritage, which include the music, the literature, the film, and the festivals, are the ways in which the Viking legacy is being kept alive and relevant in the 21st century, a legacy that is the source of the inspiration and the identity for the people of the Scotland. The music of the bands such as the Wardruna, the Highlam, and the other groups that perform the reconstructed Norse and the folk music, has a large and a devoted following in the Scotland, a following that is drawn to the primal and the spiritual power of the ancient sounds. The literature of the Norse in the Scotland, which includes the retellings of the sagas, the historical novels, and the scholarly works, is the continuation of the storytelling tradition that was the heart of the Norse culture. The festivals, such as the Largs Viking Festival, which commemorates the Battle of the Largs in 1263, and the Shetland Viking Festival, are the annual gatherings that bring the communities together to celebrate their Norse heritage, a heritage that is the living and the vibrant part of the Scottish culture. The modern revival of the Viking heritage, which is the product of the centuries of the history and the myth, is the ultimate expression of the enduring power of the Norse legacy in the Scotland. The story of the Viking invasion of the Scotland and the colonization of the Northern and the Western Isles is, in the final analysis, the story of the creation of a world that was born in the violence and the destruction, but that grew into a unique and a vibrant culture, a culture that is the foundation of the modern Scottish identity. The Vikings, who came as the raiders and the destroyers, became the settlers and the builders, the men who cleared the land, built the farms, established the trade routes, founded the political and the legal institutions, and created a new and a hybrid society, the Norse-Gaelic world of the Kingdom of the Isles and the Earldom of Orkney. The Picts and the Gaels, who were the victims of the initial onslaught, were not entirely destroyed or expelled, but were gradually absorbed into the new society, a process that was the result of the intermarriage, the conversion, and the mutual accommodation. The legacy of the Viking Age, which is written in the DNA, the language, the place names, the archaeology, the architecture, the art, the law, and the culture of the region, is a permanent and an enduring testament to the power of the human capacity for the adaptation, the resilience, and the creation. We have journeyed together through the many facets of this remarkable story, from the first Viking raids on the monasteries of the Hebrides and the Iona in the late 8th century to the final absorption of the Norse territories into the Scottish kingdom in the 13th century, from the archaeology of the Jarlshof and the Bersi to the sagas of the Earls of Orkney and the Sea Kings of the Isles. From the genetics of the modern islanders to the language and the place names of the Norse legacy, from the pagan graves and the silver hoards to the Christian crosses and the cathedrals of the Romanesque style, from the political evolution of the earldom and the kingdom to the cultural fusion of the Norse and the Gael, from the maritime and the trade networks to the modern revival of the Viking heritage. The story of the Norse and the Scotland is a story that is both a tragedy and a triumph, a story of the violence and the destruction that was the prelude to the creation of a new and a lasting society. The true treasure of the Viking Age, which is the legacy of the blood, the language, the culture, and the spirit of the Norse-Gaelic people, is the invisible foundation of the modern Scotland, a foundation that is the product of the centuries of the history and the myth, and that is the source of the identity and the pride of the Scottish nation. The longships have sailed, and the sea kings have fallen, but the echoes of their passing can still be heard in the winds that sweep across the northern and the western isles, a call to the adventure and the discovery that is the spirit of the Viking Age. The Norse and the Scotland, who were once the strangers and the enemies, are now the ancestors and the heroes, a transformation that is the ultimate legacy of the Viking Age and the enduring testament to the power of the human story. Before we part, I have a small but vital request. If this epic journey through the Viking invasion of the Scotland and the Northern Isles has ignited your curiosity and deepened your understanding of the Norse heritage, please leave a like right now. It helps this video reach more history lovers, and we are marching toward our goal of 1,000 likes. Take a moment to subscribe to the channel and ring the notification bell, so you never miss a new episode when we uncover another hidden chapter of our shared past. Your comments are the compass that guides our future explorations, so write down your thoughts below. What is the most fascinating aspect of the Viking legacy in the Scotland? The DNA, the language, the sagas, or something else entirely? Share this video with a friend who loves the Viking history. Let's grow this community of seekers together. I hope you enjoyed this content, and I'll see you in the next video.